There was no warning. No herald of trumpets, no divine light splitting the heavens to announce what was coming. There was only pressure, absolute, suffocating, and ancient beyond any measurement the gods had ever devised. The void between universes, that sacred emptiness which belonged to nothing and no one, began to contract. Across all 12 universes, stars flickered simultaneously, not from cosmic accident, but from something far more primal. They dimmed because they recognized what had arrived, and their most ancient instinct was to bow. Vegeta stood at the center of that contraction. His armor was long gone, shattered across 3 separate battles that had each felt like the end of everything. What remained on his body were strips of burned fabric and the dried evidence of wounds that should have killed him. Wounds that would have killed any other being in existence. His left arm hung at an angle that anatomy did not permit. His right eye was sealed shut beneath a ridge of bruised flesh. The golden flame of Ultra Ego still clung to his form, but it no longer roared. It sputtered. It gasped. It clung to him the way a dying torch clings to its last thread of oxygen. Not because it was strong, but because he refused to release it. Behind him, the shattered remains of what had once been the Grand Prix Sanctum drifted in silent pieces through the void. Pillars of divine architecture, marble infused with the compressed prayers of 10 billion years of godhood, floated like ash. The throne of the angels, that impossibly elegant structure carved from crystallized time itself, had been split down the center, not by a weapon, by his ki, by the raw, unfiltered eruption of a Saiyan who had been told once too many times that he did not belong in the presence of gods. Whis floated 30 meters away, his staff held not in casual elegance, but in genuine defensive posture, something no being alive had ever witnessed from an angel. Beerus, the god of destruction, who had once reduced civilizations to memory with a gesture, knelt on a fragment of floating debris, not in reverence, in exhaustion. His divine energy, that deep, violet hum of destruction that had defined his existence for millions of years, was cracked at its foundation. He breathed in shallow increments, as though breathing too deeply might remind his body of how close to dissolution he truly was. Vegeta had done this. Vegeta had brought them to this. But none of it mattered now, because something had arrived in the space above him. Something that made the destruction behind Vegeta look like the tantrum of a child. A presence materialized without ceremony, without transition. It did not descend. It did not appear. It simply was, suddenly and completely, as though it had always been there and reality had only now caught up to the fact. A figure of impossible smallness, deceptively, mockingly small, hovered in the void. Its robes were not white or gold or any color that light typically produced. They were the color of the space between colors. Its eyes, when they opened, did not glow. They absorbed. Every photon that touched them vanished. Vegeta looked up at it, his one good eye narrowing. And for the first time since Goku had died, since the world had cracked and the rage had swallowed him whole, and he had become something that even gods feared, Vegeta felt something he had not expected to feel again. He felt small. Before the next strike of destiny falls, remain. Bear witness, because what happens in the next few moments will not be recorded in any divine scripture. It will only survive if someone is watching. It did not speak immediately. That was the first thing Vegeta registered. Not its size, not its robes, not the impossible geometry of its presence that made the surrounding void seem to fold inward like paper approaching a flame. What struck him first was the silence it carried. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of completion. The silence of something so total, so thoroughly itself, that sound itself became redundant in its proximity. The void between universes had always been quiet, but this was different. This was the quiet of a library that contained every word ever spoken, and had therefore stopped needing to hear any more of them. Vegeta's golden flame guttered. He felt it before he understood it. That involuntary dimming, that biological flinching of his ki, as something in the deepest architecture of his energy recognized a hierarchy it had never been designed to challenge. Every transformation he had ever achieved, every threshold he had crossed, every boundary he had shattered through sheer refusal to accept limitation, All of it suddenly felt like the achievements of an insect who had climbed very impressively to the top of a very tall blade of grass and was now looking up for the first time at the mountain range that began where the meadow ended. He hated that feeling. He had hated it the first time he felt it. As a child, standing before his father, being told that his power level was unremarkable. He had hated it on Namek, kneeling in his own blood while Frieza laughed. He had hated it every single time the universe had tried to remind him of his place, his ceiling, his limitations, as though limitation were a law rather than a suggestion. And he hated it now, standing broken in the wreckage of the Angel Sanctum, one arm ruined, one eye sealed, his ultra ego barely holding its shape around a body that had absorbed more damage than any living thing had a right to survive. But hatred for Vegeta had never been a reason to stop. It had always been a reason to continue. He straightened, slowly, deliberately, with the kind of controlled physical effort that is more statement than movement. The way a king rises from a throne, not because he is comfortable, but because rising is what kings do regardless of comfort. The golden violet flame around him steadied. It did not roar back to its former intensity. It could not, but it held. And in holding, it declared something that no amount of cosmic pressure had yet managed to contradict. I am still here. The figure above him tilted its head. A fractional movement, perhaps 10 degrees to the left. In a being of ordinary scale, it would have meant curiosity. In this entity, it felt like the reorientation of a continent. You are the one. Its voice arrived not through air, there was no air in the void, but through the substrate of reality itself. The words did not travel. They simply existed, fully formed, in every point in space simultaneously, as though language were merely a formality it was performing out of courtesy to the lesser being below. The Saiyan who broke the sanctum, who struck the Grand Priest, who brought a god of destruction to his knees. Vegeta said nothing. His jaw was set. His one functional eye tracked the figure with the precise calculating attention of a warrior who had learned through decades of brutal experience that the moment before a fight reveals more than the fight itself. I have not descended in 700 million years, the figure continued. Its tone carried no anger, no threat, no particular inflection of any kind. It spoke the way gravity operates, without malice, without preference, simply as an expression of what it fundamentally was. The last time I found it necessary to do so, there was a civilization in what you now call Universe 7 that had begun developing techniques capable of affecting the structural integrity of the void itself. I erased them. Not their planet, not their star system. A pause so brief it should not have registered, and yet Vegeta felt it like a held breath. Their concept. I removed the idea of them from the fabric of what is possible. They did not simply cease to exist, they ceased to have ever existed. The temperature of the void dropped another several degrees. Vegeta felt it in the wound on his arm, the exposed tissue contracting, the already compromised nerves firing in protest. He did not move. "And you are telling me this?" Vegeta said, his voice rough and low, stripped of every performative layer by exhaustion until only the core of him remained. "Because you want me to understand what you are capable of." "I am telling you this," the figure replied, "because I want you to understand what restraint looks like." Something shifted in Vegeta's expression. Not fear, not deference. Something more complicated. The expression of a man who has received a threat sophisticated enough to momentarily earn his intellectual respect, even as every other part of him prepares to reject it entirely. "Restraint," he repeated. The word tasted wrong in his mouth, like being handed a crown made of someone else's surrender. "You have disrupted the divine order that I constructed across the span of what your kind calls eternity," the Grand Omni-King said. Still no anger. That was almost the worst part. There was nothing to push against, no heat to mirror, no rage to absorb and redirect, only this vast, patient, geological certainty. The Grand Priest served a function. The angels served a function. Zeno, my successor, serves a function. You have damaged 3 of those functions in the span of what amounts to, by my reckoning, a single exhaled breath. "Your successor," Vegeta said quietly. Something about that word caught in him. He filed it away, with the precision of a warrior, cataloging battlefield intelligence. Successor, not son, not creation. Successor, Does that surprise you? Everything about this conversation surprises me, Vegeta said flatly. I'm choosing to pay attention to the parts that matter. For the second time, the figure tilted its head, and this time, the movement was slightly different. No longer the reorientation of curiosity, but something closer to the adjustment of an observer who has encountered a specimen that does not behave according to established parameters. You are not afraid, it said. I am, Vegeta replied. With a directness so stark, it functioned almost as its own form of defiance. I have been afraid since the moment you arrived. My ki recognized you before my mind did, and it reacted the way ki always reacts to something that exists beyond its ceiling. It flinched. I felt it flinch. His eye did not waver. But I have been afraid before. Of Frieza, of Cell, of Beerus, of my own inadequacy, which was the most persistent fear of all. And I have learned, through every single one of those encounters, that fear is not a command. It is information. I choose what to do with it. The void was very still. Whis, still 30 meters back, had not moved. He was not breathing, not because he could not, but because he understood, with the preternatural clarity of an angel who had served the divine order for longer than most civilizations had existed, that any movement he made right now would be catastrophically misread. Beerus, on his fragment of debris, had raised his head. His purple eyes, usually half-lidded with the casual boredom of a god who had seen everything, were fully open. He was watching Vegeta the way one watches a man standing at the edge of a cliff, making arguments to the wind. You choose, the Grand Omni-King said, and for the first time, something entered its voice. Not anger, not admiration, something in between. A quality that an entity beyond emotion might produce when it encounters a concept it had theoretically understood, but never practically witnessed at this scale. A Saiyan, choosing against this. Against you, Vegeta clarified. Yes. The pressure changed. It did not increase violently. It deepened. The way water pressure deepens as you descend, not through aggression, but through accumulation. Vegeta felt it against every surface of his body simultaneously, felt his ultra-ego flame compress inward, felt the key pathways throughout his body constrict under a weight that had no physical source. His knees, and this was the part that cost him, the part that registered as humiliation in the deepest chamber of his pride, bent. Not fully, not in submission, but they bent. His teeth locked together. The tendons in his neck stood out like cables under tension. The flame around him flickered, violet gold, guttering, refusing, as his body fought a battle that his body was not built to win. Get up, he told himself. Get up. But it was in that moment of maximum compression, that instant where the pressure of the Grand Omni-King's presence bore down on him with the full accumulated weight of an authority that predated the current universe, that had authored the rules by which all power was measured, that something else happened. Something broke. Not his will, not his body. Something inside his ki, a fracture, hairline, precise, running through the deepest layer of his energy like a crack through ancient stone, opened along a fault line he had never known existed. And through that crack, from somewhere impossibly far below the architecture of his current power, something breathed. Something old. Something that did not recognize the Grand Omni-King's authority. Something that had existed before that authority was established. Vegeta's eyes went wide. The ultra-ego flame around him stuttered, and then, in the space of a single heartbeat, changed color. The gold bled out of it first, that familiar blazing aureate light that had defined Super Saiyan transformations across generations, that defiant beacon which had burned across battlefields from Namek to the Tournament of Power, drained from his aura as though someone had pulled a plug at the base of his soul. It did not fade gradually. It left with the sudden finality of a candle snuffed between two fingers. And what remained in the space it vacated was not darkness. It was something that had no right to exist in the current universe. The color that replaced it existed at the edge of human and divine perception. It was not quite crimson, not quite black, not quite the deep amber of a dying star collapsing into its final breath. It occupied the space between all of those things simultaneously, shifting between them the way heat shifts above scorched earth, never fully committing to any single frequency because it was older than the system that had invented frequencies. Vegeta's hair, still spiked, still reaching upward, with that characteristic Saiyan refusal to submit to gravity, darkened at its roots and lightened at its tips, creating a gradient that moved like smoke caught in an updraft. His pupils dilated, then contracted, then dilated again, as though his eyes were trying to process a visual input his optic nerves had not been built to receive. The pressure from the Grand Omni-King did not diminish, but Vegeta stopped sinking. His knees, those traitorous, exhausted knees that had begun to buckle under the weight of an authority older than creation, locked. The tendons that had been screaming in protest went quiet, not because the weight had lessened, but because something in the newly fractured architecture of his ki had responded to the weight. The way a root system responds to pressure from above by driving itself deeper into the earth rather than collapsing under the load. He did not understand what was happening to him. That was perhaps the most disorienting aspect of the entire experience. More disorienting than the Grand Omni-King's presence. More disorienting than the color of his own aura. More disorienting than the fact that his body was doing something his mind had not authorized. Vegeta had always understood his transformations. Even the ones that had arrived in crisis, Super Saiyan for the first time in the gravity chamber, Ultra Ego during the Tournament of Power's brutal final hours. He had understood them in the moment of their arrival, recognized them as extensions of a logic he had been building toward. He had known, each time, what he was becoming. He did not know this. The fracture in his ki pulsed. Once, twice, like a heartbeat that belonged to someone else. Something else, beating in the cavity of his chest alongside his own. It did not feel hostile. It did not feel foreign in the way that something invasive feels foreign. It felt, impossibly, like memory. Like the sensation of walking into a room you have never entered and knowing, with irrational certainty, exactly where the furniture is. Like hearing a word spoken in a language you were never taught and understanding it anyway. In the marrow, in the place below thought where the oldest parts of the self reside. The Grand Omni-King had gone still. Not the stillness of calculation, not the stillness of an entity conserving energy before a strike. This was something Vegeta had never expected to witness in any being, let alone in the architect of all divine order. The stillness of recognition, as though the entity above him had encountered something it had not seen in a very, very long time. As though a locked door, one it had sealed personally with absolute confidence that it would never be opened again, had just, quietly, without drama, without any fanfare whatsoever, clicked. "What?" the Grand Omni-King said, and for the first time its voice arrived through the normal channels of sound rather than through reality's substrate, which meant Vegeta understood instinctively that it was no longer performing courtesy. It was genuinely speaking. "What is that?" Vegeta looked at his own hands. The aura crackled between his fingers, that ancient, nameless color flowing across his skin like the surface of something volcanic, something pressurized and primal. He could feel it in his palms. Not the familiar burn of Ultra Ego, that exquisite, self-destructive feedback loop of damage converted to power. This was different. This was depth rather than heat. This was the sensation of looking down into a well and realizing that the darkness below is not the absence of something, but the presence of something so large that light has simply never been able to reach the bottom of it. He closed his fingers slowly into fists. The aura responded. It didn't flare outward the way Super Saiyan power flared. Aggressive, radiating, territorial. It compressed. It drew inward and downward, concentrating rather than expanding. And the void around Vegeta seemed to deepen in response, as though the space itself was making room for something that required more of it. "I don't know," Vegeta said honestly. The admission cost him nothing. He had spent too many years performing certainty he didn't possess to waste energy on it now, here, at what might genuinely be the last moments of his existence. "But I intend to find out." He lifted his gaze back to the Grand Omni-King, and what he saw, what he registered in the geometry of that impossibly ancient presence, stopped his breath for the span of exactly 1 second. The Grand Omni-King had moved backward, not far, perhaps 2 meters, perhaps less, an increment so small that in any other context it would have been meaningless, a postural adjustment, a shift of weight with no implication. But this was the being that had not found it necessary to descend from its plane of existence in 700 million years. This was the entity that had erased not just civilizations, but concepts, that had removed ideas from the architecture of the possible, as casually as a reader removes a bookmark from a page. This was the author of the divine hierarchy that governed all 12 universes, the entity before whom Zeno himself was merely a designated successor, before whom angels were merely tools, before whom gods of destruction were merely functions in a system it had designed. It had moved backward, 2 meters, perhaps less, but backward. Beerus made a sound, barely audible, less than a syllable, more than silence. Whis turned his head toward his charge with an expression that existed in the precise territory between awe and terror, and said nothing, because there was nothing in the vocabulary of divine service that had prepared him for this particular moment. Vegeta felt the fracture in his ki pulse again, stronger this time, more insistent, and with it came something he had not anticipated. Not power, not heat, not the intoxicating rush of transformation that he had come to associate with every threshold he had ever crossed. What came through the fracture was imagery, fragmented, rapid, disorienting, a battlefield unlike any he had ever seen. Not the sterile void of the Tournament of Power, not the dramatic landscapes of Namek or the hyperbolic time chamber, but something vast and geological, a plain of dark earth beneath a sky that held 2 suns, and neither of them were yellow. Warriors moving across that plain in formations that spoke of a military discipline far older and more sophisticated than anything the current Saiyan civilization had produced. Ki, but not the Ki he knew. Ki that moved differently, that behaved according to rules his body understood implicitly, but his mind had never been taught. A throne, carved not from any material he could name, occupied by a figure whose silhouette was achingly, inexplicably familiar. And then a sound, a name, spoken in a language that had not been used in 10,000 years. It detonated through Vegeta's consciousness like a depth charge, silent on the surface, catastrophic below. He gasped. Audibly, involuntarily, the sound tore out of him before he could suppress it, before pride could intervene, and he pressed his fist against his sternum as though he could physically hold the fracture closed, while simultaneously understanding, with absolute certainty, that closing it was the last thing he should do. The vision lasted less than 3 seconds. It left him shaking, not from weakness, from weight, from the specific, overwhelming gravitational pull of something enormous pressing up through the floor of his identity, demanding recognition, demanding continuation, carrying with it the accumulated momentum of a bloodline that had been silenced for 10 millennia and had apparently been waiting in the substrate of his DNA, in the compressed fossil record of his ki, for exactly this moment to make itself known. The Grand Omni-King watched him. "You felt it," it said, quietly, in the tone that carried, beneath its characteristic absence of inflection, something that Vegeta, with the particular sensitivity of a man who had spent his entire life learning to read power in all its forms, identified as the one emotion he had never expected to detect in the architect of all creation. Apprehension. "I felt something," Vegeta said carefully, straightening, the ancient aura still moving across his skin in those slow volcanic pulses. "A memory that isn't mine, a name I don't recognize, but somehow already know. A battlefield I've never stood on." He paused. His jaw worked. A Saiyan king. The silence that followed was of a different quality than all the silences that had preceded it. It was the silence of a secret being recognized. "You should not be able to access that," the Grand Omni-King said. And now, in this moment, something had finally entered its voice that all the defiance and all the refusal and all the extraordinary violence of the preceding hours had failed to produce. Urgency. "And yet," Vegeta said. The Grand Omni-King did not respond immediately. That silence, that particular quality of pause from an entity that had never needed to pause, that had never encountered a situation which required the gathering of something as mortal and fallible as composure, stretched across the void like a fault line opening in slow motion. Vegeta watched it. He watched the way the ancient figure's robe shifted without wind, The way the space immediately surrounding it seemed to breathe differently than the space around everything else. The way its eyes, those absorbing, lightless eyes that swallowed photons like collapsed stars, moved across him with an attention that felt geological, like being studied by something that measured time in epochs rather than moments. Vegeta used the silence. Every warrior learned this eventually, that silence in a confrontation was not dead space, but live territory. And the fighter who used it better almost always survived longer than the fighter who rushed to fill it. He breathed, carefully, deliberately, drawing air into lungs that ached from the inside out, cycling it through a body that was held together at this point more by will than by any structural integrity his cells could honestly claim. He felt the fracture in his ki with each breath, that hairline opening running through the deepest layer of his energy, pulsing with a rhythm that was not quite his own. He did not push it. He did not pull it. He simply acknowledged it, the way you acknowledge a door that is opened in a wall you believed was solid before deciding whether to walk through. The imagery from the vision still burned behind his eyes. That battlefield, those two suns, the formations of warriors moving with a precision and discipline that made the Saiyan army of his own era, for all its brutality, for all its fearsome reputation across the galaxies it had conquered, look like children playing at war. And that throne, that figure, the silhouette that his conscious mind could not identify, but something deeper, something in the bedrock of his identity, in the geological record of his bloodline, recognized with an immediacy that bypassed logic entirely and arrived directly in the chest as physical sensation. Who are you? He thought, directing the question inward, into the fracture, into the pulse that beat alongside his own. What are you trying to show me? The fracture pulsed once, and the ghost of the vision flickered at the edge of his perception, not returning fully, not opening into that overwhelming flood of imagery again, but present, waiting, like a story that had been interrupted and had not forgotten its place. The bloodline was sealed. The Grand Omni-King said finally. Its voice had changed. The quality that had made it feel omnidirectional, that characteristic of existing at every point in space simultaneously, had narrowed. It now came from a specific direction, from the specific location where the entity hovered, which meant it was no longer broadcasting with casual omnipotence, but speaking, addressing. The distinction was subtle, and Vegeta caught it immediately, filed it alongside the backward movement and the urgency, building a picture that was becoming increasingly, dangerously interesting. Sealed by whom? Vegeta said. By me. No hesitation. No evasion. The Grand Omni-King offered this admission with the same affectless certainty with which it offered everything, not as a confession, but as a statement of completed action. The way you might say, I built that wall without feeling the need to justify the construction. 10,417 years ago, by the reckoning of what is now Universe 7's calendar, the last carrier of that bloodline was located, isolated, and the inheritance, the specific key genetic sequence that carries the memory of the ancient compact, was suppressed, buried beneath 17 successive generations of dilution. The mathematics of biology were expected to do what direct intervention might have made conspicuous. Vegeta absorbed this. The implications arranged themselves in his mind with the cold efficiency of a tactician processing battlefield intelligence. 17 generations. Someone, something, had looked at his bloodline 10 millennia ago and decided that what it carried was dangerous enough to spend 17 generations quietly, systematically dismantling. Not through violence, through dilution, through the patient, unhurried manipulation of who married whom, who survived and who did not, which key genetic traits were allowed to propagate, and which were gently, invisibly starved of the conditions they needed to flourish. His father, his father's father, every Saiyan who had stood between him and that ancient throne. Managed, curated, reduced. Something moved through Vegeta's chest that was not quite rage, and not quite grief, and not quite the cold fire of wounded pride. It was all three simultaneously, layered and compressed. The specific emotional signature of a man discovering that the obstacles of his entire life were not random. Not the neutral indifference of a universe that simply didn't care, but deliberate. constructed by a hand so far above the architecture of his reality that he had never even known to look for it. It didn't work, he said. His voice was very quiet. Evidently not. And there it was again, that quality beneath the words, that apprehension wearing the clothes of neutrality. The suppression was designed to hold indefinitely under normal conditions. But the events of the preceding cycles, the damage you have sustained, the extremity of your key expenditure, the specific resonance pattern generated by ultra ego operating at its absolute threshold, appear to have created conditions that are not normal. The suppression fractured. The sequence beneath it is now. Another pause, fractional but present. Active, Vegeta repeated. He looked at his hands again. The aura moved across them in those slow pulses. That ancient, nameless color that had no place in the current universe's chromatic vocabulary. You mean awakening? The Grand Omni-King said nothing, which was, Vegeta had learned in the last several minutes, its version of confirmation. He breathed through the weight of that, through the enormity of what it implied. Not just for this moment, not just for this confrontation in the shattered void above the ruins of the divine sanctum, but for everything. For the question of why Saiyans had been what they were. Warriors, conquerors, biological weapons deployed in service of others, rather than what, apparently, they had once been. For the question of what had been taken from his people so thoroughly that even the memory of it had been erased, leaving only the instincts, the hunger for battle, the exponential growth under pressure, the refusal to accept ceilings. Without the understanding of what those instincts had originally been for. Tell me about the ancient compact, he said. No. Tell me about the Saiyan king on that throne. No. Then tell me, Vegeta said. And now he took a step forward. One step, deliberate and unhurried, his broken arm hanging at his side, the ancient aura moving around him like something that had been asleep for 10,000 years and was only just remembering what wakefulness felt like. Why you came here yourself. You could have sensed something. You could have simply acted from wherever you exist when you are not descending into the planes you constructed. You have erased concepts. You have removed civilizations from the record of the possible. And yet, here you stand. He stopped and looked up at the figure with his one good eye, talking to me. The void was absolutely still. Because erasing you, the Grand Omni-King said, is no longer simple. The words landed in the silence like stones into deep water. The initial impact clean and precise, the ripples expanding outward into implications that reached further than the immediate surface. Vegeta felt them, felt the specific quality of those words, the admission embedded within them, the extraordinary thing it meant for the author of all things to acknowledge that a single broken Saiyan, standing in the wreckage of a divine sanctum, had become a problem that did not yield to the solution of erasure. Because of what's waking up in me, Vegeta said. Because of what is waking up in you, the Grand Omni-King confirmed. The ancient compact was not merely a power. It was not a transformation, a technique, a form that can be learned or copied or suppressed once it is fully manifested. It was an agreement, struck between the first Saiyan King and a force that predates my own construction of this universe. A force that does not recognize my authority because it existed before my authority was established. If that compact fully awakens in you... It stopped. Vegeta waited. If it fully awakens in you, the Grand Omni-King continued, then you do not simply become more powerful, you become outside. Outside the system, outside the hierarchy, outside the jurisdiction of erasure itself, because the force that underwrites the compact is the same force that underwrites the possibility of existence. And I cannot erase what I did not create. The fracture in Vegeta's ki pulsed, and in the pulse, the vision returned. Not fragmentary this time, not the disjointed flash of imagery that had detonated through him minutes ago. This time it arrived slowly, deliberately, like a tide coming in. The battlefield, vast and dark beneath two suns, the warriors in their ancient formations, the throne of unnamed material, the figure seated upon it, turning now, turning toward him for the first time, the silhouette resolving, the face emerging from the shadow of 10,000 years of deliberate forgetting. Vegeta's breath stopped, because the face on the throne was familiar, not identical, not a mirror, but familiar, in the architecture of the jaw, in the angle of the brow, in the particular set of the eyes that communicated across 10 millennia of suppressed bloodline, the same thing they had always communicated in every generation they had inhabited. I do not accept your sealing. The vision held for 3 seconds. Then it released him, gently, unlike the first time, receding rather than shattering, leaving him standing in the void with the ancient aura burning across his skin, and a name reverberating through the deepest chamber of his ki, a name in a language 10,000 years dead, a name that his bloodline had been carrying in silence, in secret, through 17 generations of careful diminishment, waiting for a body damaged enough, a will fierce enough, a moment desperate enough to finally let it through. He did not yet know what it meant, but he knew, with the absolute unambiguous certainty of a man who has spent his entire life learning to recognize the exact moment a battle changes, that everything had just changed. Above him, the Grand Omni-King watched, and in its lightless, absorbing eyes, behind the apprehension and the urgency and the vast geological patience of an entity that had authored reality itself, Vegeta saw something he had never expected to find there. The shadow of a problem it did not know how to solve. The name burned. It did not burn the way ki burned, that familiar, exhilarating combustion along the pathways of the body, that sensation of power moving through flesh like current through wire. This was different. This burned the way old wounds burn when the weather changes. Deep, structural, in places below the reach of ordinary sensation, in the bedrock where identity is stored rather than the surface where power is performed. It resonated through the marrow of his bones, through the compressed fossil record of his bloodline, through every generation of deliberate dilution that had been placed between him and the truth of what he carried. He did not speak it aloud. Not yet. Some instinct, ancient and precise and not entirely his own, told him that the name was not a word to be spoken carelessly into the void. That names of this order were not labels, but keys, and that a key inserted before the lock was ready accomplished nothing except announcing to anyone watching that you had found it. He filed it, pressed it down into the fracture alongside the vision, alongside the face on the throne, alongside the battlefield and the 2 suns and the warriors moving in formations that spoke of a military discipline older than the current divine hierarchy. He would return to it. He would understand it. But not here, not now, not while the Grand Omni-King still hovered above him in the void, with apprehension wearing the costume of neutrality, and the ruins of the divine sanctum drifted in silence around them both. You came here to stop it, Vegeta said. Not a question, a reconstruction. The specific practice skill of a tactician, reading a battlefield backward from its current state to the intentions that had produced it. The Grand Omni-King had descended for the first time in 700 million years. It had arrived not with overwhelming force, but with presence, with that suffocating, geological authority designed to compress rather than destroy, to diminish rather than erase. It had spoken to him, explained things to him, offered in its flat and affectless way context. An entity capable of erasing concepts did not explain itself to the things it intended to simply remove. You came here to stop it, he said again, and you found that you couldn't. So you're doing the next best thing. You're talking. Communication has its uses, the Grand Omni-King said, as does delay. Vegeta's eye narrowed. Every moment you spend talking to me is a moment the fracture continues to open. You know that. You're hoping that conversation will accomplish what erasure cannot. That you can offer me something, or show me something, or make me understand something that will cause me to choose to close it myself. The void offered nothing in response, which was again confirmation. Vegeta almost laughed. The sound that emerged was not quite laughter. It was too worn, too abraded by exhaustion and pain to achieve full expression. But the shape of it was there. The skeleton of genuine dark amusement at the extraordinary irony of standing broken and bleeding in the ruins of heaven, being diplomatically managed by the being that had constructed the concept of heaven in the first place. What would you offer me, he said, not with hunger, with the flat, assessing tone of a man who has been offered things before: power, survival, the lives of people he cared about, held out like bait on hooks that were never quite hidden well enough, and has learned to evaluate the offer before the emotion. Restoration, the Grand Omni-King said. Your companion, the one called Kakarot. The circumstances of his death can be reclassified. The erasure can be reversed. He can be returned, not as a shadow, not as a reconstruction, but genuinely returned, his timeline intact, his power preserved, his memory continuous. Something moved through Vegeta's chest. He had known it was coming, some version of it, some leverage that targeted the specific architecture of his motivation, rather than attempting to overwhelm it directly. He had known since the conversation began that an entity sophisticated enough to suppress a bloodline across 17 generations through the mathematics of biology, rather than the bluntness of direct intervention, was sophisticated enough to identify the exact pressure point and apply force there rather than anywhere else. He had known it was coming. It still landed. The image of Goku arrived with the involuntary immediacy of genuine memory, not summoned, but present, the way certain memories are present, occupying the room alongside the current moment rather than being retrieved from storage. Goku laughing with that particular quality of unself-consciousness that had always annoyed Vegeta, and that Vegeta had always, in the locked interior where honesty lived, recognized as the thing he could not replicate. Goku in battle, that extraordinary, infuriating, genuinely unprecedented being whose power had set the ceiling for Vegeta's entire adult life, and who had set it not through pride or strategy, but through the simple, devastating fact of caring about the outcome more than he cared about himself. Goku dead. The specific, terrible silence of a world that contained his body, but no longer contained him. Vegeta breathed through it. He breathed through it with the specific discipline of a man who has learned that grief, like fear, is information rather than command. He felt it fully, did not suppress it, did not redirect it into rage, did not perform indifference as a defensive measure. He simply held it, the way you hold a coal, long enough to understand its heat, without letting it decide where your hand goes next. And in exchange, he said, when he trusted his voice again, you close the fracture. You surrender the awakening sequence. The ancient compact returns to dormancy, and the suppression is reinstated, this time permanently, with measures that account for the specific conditions that produced tonight's failure. You seal it again. Yes. You seal it again, Vegeta said. And in 17 more generations, or 1700, or 17,000, whenever the next carrier is born with the right combination of damage and will and desperation, you find them. And you offer them the same deal. Or you simply erase them before they reach the threshold, whichever is more convenient. The Grand Omni-King did not deny this. And Kakarot, Vegeta continued, is returned to a universe in which the divine order is fully intact, in which the Grand Priest is restored, in which Zeno sits on his throne, distributing arbitrary judgments about which civilizations deserve to continue existing. And everything that has happened in the last several cycles amounts to nothing. No consequence, no change, no record. He would be alive, the Grand Omni-King said. He would be alive, Vegeta agreed, in a cage. In a universe that has just received a very clear demonstration that it will do whatever is necessary to maintain its own architecture, up to and including negotiating with the being who broke it, rather than simply erasing him, because erasing him is no longer simple. He paused. Do you think Kakarot would want that? What Kakarot wants is not the relevant variable. It is, to me, the ancient aura moved across his skin, those slow volcanic pulses, that color with no name in the current universe's vocabulary, deepening with each exchange as though the conversation itself was feeding it. The fracture in his ki had not closed. It had widened incrementally, steadily, with the patient momentum of geological process, not responding to will or to effort, but simply to time, to the continuation of conditions that had finally, after 10,000 years of suppression, become favorable to what had always been waiting beneath them. Vegeta could feel it widening. He suspected the Grand Omni-King could too. There is another option, the entity said. And now the quality of its voice shifted in a way that none of the preceding shifts had prepared him for. The affectlessness remained, the characteristic absence of inflection that came from existing beyond the register of ordinary emotion. But beneath it, like a frequency too low for conscious hearing, but felt in the chest cavity anyway, Something had changed. Something that Vegeta's instincts, those precise, battle-honed instruments that had kept him alive through scenarios that should have ended him on a dozen separate occasions, flagged not as threat, not as manipulation, but as something that he had no immediate category for. Honesty. Genuine, unperformed, unexpectedly vulnerable honesty. From the being that had authored all of reality. There is a reason, the Grand Omni-King said slowly, that I sealed the ancient compact rather than destroying it. A reason that the suppression was designed for dormancy rather than elimination. A reason that I have spent 700 million years not descending and have chosen tonight, against the considerable weight of my own judgment, to speak to you rather than act. It paused. The force that underwrites the compact, the force that predates my construction of this universe, that the first Saiyan King reached an agreement with, is not simply a source of power. It is a balance. One half of a duality that the current divine order has been operating with only one half of for 10,000 years. Vegeta went still. The system, the Grand Omni-King continued, is incomplete. It has been incomplete since the seal was placed. I constructed compensations, the angels, the hierarchy of destruction and creation, the careful maintenance of Zeno's authority. But compensations are not solutions. They are delays. The universe has been running on one engine for 10 millennia, and the accumulated stress of that imbalance has been building in ways that even my calculations did not fully anticipate. Another pause. Longer. What happened here tonight? Your rampage, the damage to the sanctum, the fracturing of the Grand Priest's function. These are not simply the consequences of one Saiyan's grief and rage. They are symptoms, the universe producing through the only mechanism available to it, the conditions necessary to correct an error that I made 10,000 years ago. The void held this statement, held it the way deep water holds a stone, receiving it, surrounding it, measuring its weight. Vegeta looked at the Grand Omni-King for a long time. You're telling me, he said finally, that you broke something 10,000 years ago, and the universe has been trying to fix it ever since. He breathed. And I am the fix. I am telling you, the Grand Omni-King said, with the weight of 10,000 years of unspoken admission behind each word, that I do not know. I am telling you that for the first time in an existence that predates the concept of uncertainty, I genuinely do not know what the correct action is. I am telling you that I came here tonight not only to stop you, but because I needed to see, with whatever passes in my nature for eyes, what the fracture looked like when it opened, what it produced, what you are. And, Vegeta said, the Grand Omni-King looked at him, truly looked, with that full absorbing attention that swallowed light, and said nothing for a long time. Then, you are not what I expected. No one ever is, Vegeta said quietly, and the fracture pulsed, deep and slow and inexorable. And the ancient aura burned, and the name he had not yet spoken resonated through his bloodline like a bell struck in an empty cathedral, filling every corner of the space before the last echo died. Something was coming. Something that had been waiting 10,000 years. And Vegeta, broken and burning in the ruins of heaven, stood at the threshold of it, not knowing what lay on the other side, not certain it was survivable, not certain it was even comprehensible to a mind formed in the current universe's vocabulary, but certain, absolutely, unshakably, characteristically certain, that he was going through. The Grand Omni-King withdrew, not dramatically, not with the theatrical implosion of divine energy that lesser gods employed when making exits designed to remind observers of their power. It simply receded. The way a tide recedes, without ceremony, without announcement, the water pulling back from the shore with the quiet inevitability of something that has its own reasons and does not require your understanding of them. The presence that had compressed the void, that had made stars dim across 12 universes through the sheer gravitational fact of its attention, thinned. The pressure against Vegeta's ki eased by degrees rather than all at once, as though the entity was testing, even in retreat, what he would do with each increment of restored space. Vegeta did not move. He stood in the slowly decompressing void and watched the Grand Omni-King diminish into the distance between dimensions. Watched those absorbing eyes hold on him until the last possible moment before the space between planes swallowed the figure entirely. And he cataloged every detail with the obsessive precision of a warrior who understands that everything observed in a confrontation is a potential resource in the next one. It was gone. The void exhaled. Or perhaps that was him. A long, controlled release of breath that he had been managing for the duration of the entire exchange, rationing his exhalations the way a soldier on a long march rations water. Not because breathing was optional, but because every unnecessary expenditure of energy was a luxury his body could not currently afford. He breathed now, fully. The ache of it was extraordinary. His ribcage had at least 2 fractures, he estimated, and the simple mechanical act of full respiration pressed them against each other in ways that sent white static across the edge of his vision. He breathed through it. Behind him, he heard movement. The soft displacement of whatever passed for air in this space between spaces, as Whis crossed the distance between them. The angel moved with characteristic grace, that particular quality of motion that always seemed to exist slightly outside the normal relationship between cause and effect, arriving at Vegeta's side without any of the intermediate steps being fully visible. Whis did not speak immediately. He stood beside Vegeta and looked at the space where the Grand Omni-King had been. And his expression, that face which had maintained its composure through the deaths of gods and the destruction of timelines, and every caliber of cosmic catastrophe that Vegeta had ever witnessed him navigate, was doing something that Vegeta had never seen it do before. It was uncertain. "Vegeta-san," Whis said finally, quietly, with none of the lilting, almost performative pleasantness that usually inhabited his voice. Just the name and the weight of everything that had preceded it. "I heard everything," Vegeta said. "Yes." A pause. "I rather thought you might want to discuss." "Not yet." Whis accepted this without protest, which itself communicated volumes. The angel who had been Vegeta's trainer, his most consistent observer, the being who had watched him grow from a proud and brittle prince into whatever he was now, that angel standing in silence beside him without offering commentary or guidance was, in its own way, a form of respect more substantial than any words could have been. Beerus drifted closer on his fragment of debris. The god of destruction looked diminished in a way that had nothing to do with physical damage. His divine energy had stabilized from its cracked and fractured state during the height of the battle. But something in his bearing had not recovered. He landed on what remained of the sanctum's floor, a broad drifting slab of that prayer-infused marble, and sat and looked at Vegeta with those half-lidded purple eyes that were, for once, fully open. "What it said," Beerus began. His voice carried its characteristic roughness, stripped now of its habitual laziness. "About the balance, about the universe running on one engine." "I heard it," Vegeta said. "Did you believe it?" Vegeta considered this. It was a legitimate question, the kind that deserved honest engagement rather than reflexive response. An entity capable of constructing reality had claimed, in the midst of an exchange that served its strategic interest in preventing the fracture from fully opening, that the fracture was in some sense necessary, that the seal placed 10,000 years ago had been a mistake, that the universe had been compensating for that mistake ever since, and had now, through the specific concatenation of events that had produced this night, generated the conditions required to begin correcting it. It was an extraordinarily convenient narrative for the being delivering it. It was also, Vegeta's instincts told him with uncomfortable insistence, true. He could feel the truth of it in the fracture itself, in the way it had responded not just to damage and desperation, but to something more specific, something more intentional. It had not cracked randomly. It had cracked directionally, along a fault line that already existed, in a pattern that suggested not accidental structural failure, but the opening of a seal from below as much as from above, as though what was underneath it had been pressing upward for a very long time, and the conditions of this night had finally constituted the minimum threshold it required. "Yes," he said, "I believe it." Beerus absorbed this. "Then what are you going to do?" "Find out what was sealed." The answer arrived without deliberation, because it was not a decision, but a statement of the only logical next step available to him. "The vision gave me fragments, a battlefield, a face, a name in a dead language. That's not enough. I need the source." "The source," Whis said carefully, "of a memory sealed by the Grand Omni-King across 17 generations of your bloodline, would not be stored in any location that I am aware of within the current. It wouldn't be stored in the current divine archive, Vegeta said. It would be stored where the Grand Omni-King couldn't reach it, somewhere outside the jurisdiction of the hierarchy. He paused, and the fracture pulsed, and in the pulse, a fragment of the vision surfaced. Not the battlefield this time, not the throne, but something else. Something at the edge of the imagery that he had not consciously registered in the two previous occurrences. A location, dark earth, yes, and two suns, but also a specific quality of gravity, a specific atmospheric pressure, a specific orientation of celestial bodies that his body, carrying the bloodline that carried the memory, recognized as coordinates. There's a place, he said slowly. The memory knows where it happened, where the compact was struck, where the first king established whatever it was he established. Vegeta-san, we said, and now the gentle caution was back in his voice. That particular register he employed when he was about to say something he knew would not be well received. The Grand Omni-King withdrew. It did not surrender. It will be, reconsidering its approach. Whatever window exists between its retreat and its next action is not a large one. Then I'll move quickly. You cannot move at all, we said, with the precise directness of someone who has decided that honesty is more useful than tact. Your left arm has multiple fractures. You have 2 broken ribs. Your key pathways have been operating at sustained critical overload for, by my estimate, the last 4 hours. The suppression fracture has altered the fundamental architecture of how your energy moves through your body. And until you understand the new configuration, attempting to move at your current power output risks— I know what it risks, Vegeta said. Then you know that attempting to travel to wherever this location is, in your current condition, before you understand what is awakening in you, is precisely the kind of decision that produces outcomes which cannot be recovered from. Vegeta said nothing for a moment. Then he looked at his hands again, at the ancient aura moving across them, that slow volcanic pulse, that nameless color breathing between his fingers like something alive. He flexed the fingers of his functioning right hand slowly, feeling the way the energy responded. It was different from anything he had trained with, different from Super Saiyan in all its iterations, different from the blue and its variants, different from Ultra Instinct, and different from Ultra Ego. It did not feel like an upgrade. It did not feel like the next rung on a ladder whose structure he understood. It felt like a different ladder entirely, one that went down into the earth rather than up into the sky, not toward transcendence, but toward foundation, toward the bedrock where things had been built before the current architecture existed to shape what they became. I'm not moving tonight, he said finally. Whis visibly processed this concession, clearly having prepared for more resistance. That is unexpectedly sensible. Don't celebrate yet. Vegeta lowered his hand. I need 3 things. I need time for the fracture to continue opening under controlled conditions. Not forced, not suppressed, just observed. I need to understand the new configuration before I attempt to use it. He looked at Whis, and I need you to tell me everything you know about the period before the current divine order. Everything that existed before the Grand Omni-King established the hierarchy we know. Whis was quiet for a long moment. That, he said carefully, is a subject that angels are not, technically, permitted to discuss. I'm aware. The restriction exists for reasons that the Grand Omni-King— The Grand Omni-King, Vegeta said, with a flatness that closed the argument like a door, just admitted to me that it made an error 10,000 years ago and has been maintaining compensatory systems ever since. Its information architecture has a demonstrated conflict of interest. He met Whis' eyes. Tell me what you know. Another silence. Longer. Whis looked at his staff, that crystalline implement that was both tool and symbol, and something more than either, with an expression that suggested internal negotiation of a genuinely difficult kind. The negotiation between loyalty to a system that had defined his existence and the recognition that the system itself had just been revealed as operating on incomplete and possibly compromised foundations. I know very little, Whis said finally. What angels are permitted to know about the pre-hierarchy era is deliberately restricted, but I know. Because certain things cannot be entirely erased from the memory of beings who exist outside of time. that the era before the Grand Omni-King's construction of the current order was not a void. It was not chaos. It was a different kind of order, one in which the balance of forces was distributed differently. The Saiyans, Vegeta said. Among others, Whis said carefully. But yes, among others. Beerus had been listening with an expression of deep, uncharacteristic stillness. The god of destruction, who demolished worlds as a matter of professional function, who had once famously destroyed half a planet because the food displeased him, sat on his fragment of debris and processed the information with the gravity of someone recognizing that the ground beneath every assumption he had ever held was not as solid as it had appeared. Warriors who were rivals of gods, Beerus said slowly, echoing something from the vision without knowing its source. His eyes moved to Vegeta. That's what you saw, isn't it? In whatever hit you when the fracture opened. Yes. Not servants, not weapons deployed in service of others. Beerus's voice carried something unusual, not quite discomfort, not quite awe, occupying the specific territory between those two things where genuinely destabilizing information tends to land. Rivals. Equals, Vegeta corrected. And in saying it, in placing that word in the air between them, he felt the fracture pulse in what he was beginning to recognize as affirmation. That deep, rhythmic response of the ancient thing within him to statements that aligned with what it carried. The compact wasn't a surrender. It wasn't the Saiyans swearing allegiance to a divine hierarchy. It was an agreement between parties of comparable standing, a recognition of mutual necessity, which the Grand Omni-King then spent the next interval eliminating one party of, Beerus said. Not eliminating, Vegeta said. Reducing. There's a difference. Elimination leaves a gap, a visible absence that draws questions. Reduction is quieter. You don't erase the bloodline, you dilute it. You don't destroy the memory, you bury it under 17 generations of careful management. You maintain the Saiyans as a useful military force. Keep the combat instincts, keep the battle hunger, keep the exponential growth under pressure, because that part is still useful to you. But you remove the understanding. You separate the instrument from the knowledge of what the instrument was originally for. The void held this. The ruins of the divine sanctum drifted around them in their slow, orbiting silence. Fragments of crystallized time from the shattered angel's throne caught what little light existed in the void between universes and held it briefly before releasing it. A slow, melancholy refraction, like watching the last light move through the windows of a house being demolished. Vegeta looked at those fragments, and the fracture pulsed, and the ancient aura breathed, and the name he still had not spoken resonated through the bedrock of his identity like a foundation being tested from below. Not breaking, but asserting, pressing upward into the structure built above it with the patient, inexorable insistence of something that has been waiting 10,000 years and has learned the difference between hurrying and arriving. He was not ready. Not tonight, not in this body, with these fractures, with an awakening he did not yet understand moving through his ki like a tide whose full dimensions he could not yet measure. He was not ready to go to the place the memory indicated. He was not ready to speak the name. He was not ready to stand before whatever waited at the source of the ancient compact and declare himself its inheritor. But he would be. The certainty of that was not pride. It was not the performative confidence of a man who has decided to believe something because the alternative is despair. It was structural. The specific load-bearing certainty of a foundation being tested from below and discovering that what is underneath it is not emptiness, but bedrock. He would be ready. In the universe, all 12 of it, that incomplete compensating single-engine system running on the absence of what his bloodline carried, would wait. He slept. Not immediately. Sleep did not come to Vegeta the way it came to ordinary beings, as a natural surrender at the end of exhaustion. It had to be chosen, deliberately, the way every vulnerable thing in his life had to be chosen deliberately, against the resistance of a pride that had spent decades equating unconsciousness with defeat. But Whis had been precise and unambiguous in his assessment of the key pathway damage, and Vegeta had learned, slowly, grudgingly, across years of training that had humbled him in ways battle never quite managed, to distinguish between the pride that made him stronger and the pride that simply got him killed. He chose sleep. Whis constructed something in the void, Not a room, not quite, but a stabilized pocket of dimensional space, sealed against the pressure differentials of the between-universe environment, temperature regulated, gravity normalized to approximately the conditions of a planet with a mass close enough to Earth's that his body would not waste energy compensating for the difference. It was spare and characterless, this improvised sanctuary. No surfaces that could be called walls, no ceiling in any architectural sense. Just a volume of space that had been persuaded to behave consistently. Vegeta lay on the key-compressed platform Whis generated and stared at nothing and let the fracture do what it was doing without interference. He could feel it, even in stillness. That slow tidal widening, patient and inevitable, and entirely indifferent to his conscious participation. It did not require his effort. It did not require his permission. It required only the continuation of the conditions that had produced it. The specific concatenation of damage and will and necessity that had constituted the minimum threshold. And those conditions were still present, because the damage was still present, and the will had never wavered, and the necessity had not been resolved by a single conversation with the architect of all reality. He closed his eyes, and the dreams were not dreams. He understood this immediately, that what arrived when consciousness thinned was not the ordinary processing of memory and anxiety that constituted human dreaming, not even the more vivid, chi-saturated experiences that warriors sometimes reported from the hyperbolic edges of deep meditation. This was the fracture continuing its work while the conscious mind's interference was minimized. This was the ancient thing within him, using the quiet of his sleeping body the way water uses a crack in stone. Not forcefully, not dramatically, but with the accumulated patience of something that has all the time it needs and knows precisely where it is going. The battlefield returned, fully this time, completely, without the fragmentation or the overwhelming sensory detonation of the waking visions. Instead, with the particular clarity that the mind sometimes achieves in its deepest states, that crystalline resolution where every detail is present and legible, and the observing self moves through the experience with the simultaneous awareness of participant and witness. He stood on the dark earth beneath two suns. The earth was unlike any planetary surface he had experienced. Dense and ancient and extraordinarily heavy. The gravity approximately 3 times what he had grown up under, which meant that every warrior moving across this battlefield was operating under conditions that would have been punishing to beings not specifically evolved for it. But the warriors moved as though the gravity were irrelevant, not ignoring it, not fighting it, but using it. Their ki drawing on the additional pressure the way Ultra Ego drew on damage, converting what should have been limitation into fuel. They were Saiyans. He knew them immediately, not from physical resemblance alone, but from the quality of their ki. That signature combination of battle hunger and exponential potential that he recognized from his own body as the fundamental frequency of his people. But they were not the Saiyans he knew. They were not the colonizers and conquerors that Frieza had employed as biological weapons across the galaxies. They were not the people who had been reduced, generation by generation, to instruments in service of others. These Saiyans were sovereign. It was visible in everything. In the architecture of their formations, which spoke of strategic intelligence rather than mere ferocity. In the quality of their ki, which moved with a control and precision that suggested lifetimes of cultivation rather than the raw, instinct-driven power that characterized the Saiyan military of his era. In the way they held themselves, in the particular geometry of their bearing that communicated not aggression but authority. Not the aggression of beings who need to dominate to feel secure, but the authority of beings who have never been asked to question whether they belong in the space they occupy. They were at war. The enemy was not immediately visible as a specific force. It manifested rather as a quality of pressure from the sky, from the space above the battlefield, from the direction of what Vegeta gradually understood was not simply atmosphere, but divine jurisdiction. The current order pressing down, the hierarchy that had decided at some point in this ancient conflict that the existence of beings who stood outside its system of authority constituted an unacceptable variable. And at the center of it, at the apex of the Saiyan formation, where the pressure from above was greatest and the response to it was therefore required to be most intense. The throne, not placed passively, not positioned at a distance from the conflict in the manner of commanders who direct from safety. The throne was at the front, carried, Vegeta now understood, not on any physical conveyance, but on the ki of the warriors surrounding it, elevated above the battlefield not for the sake of the one who sat upon it, but for the sake of visibility, for the sake of the thousands behind who needed to see that what they were fighting for was still standing. And the figure upon it. He walked toward it through the battle, as though the surrounding conflict existed in a slightly different layer of reality, present, real, consequential, but not immediately his to navigate. The warriors moved around him and through him without acknowledgement. The way the figures in a deep memory move, participating in their moment without awareness of the observer outside it. The figure on the throne was looking at the sky, at the pressure from above, at the divine hierarchy pressing down on this civilization with the particular quality of force that was not quite destruction and not quite restraint, something between them, something that wanted this to end without the mess of direct erasure, that wanted the Saiyans to simply understand their place and accept it, and stop requiring this expenditure of divine effort. Vegeta stopped 10 meters from the throne, and the figure turned. The face was older than it had appeared in the flash of the previous visions, age carrying itself differently on features like these, not as diminishment but as accumulation, as the visible record of a life that had insisted on continuing past every point where continuation became expensive. The jaw, the brow, the eyes, all familiar in their architecture, all carrying that expression, that specific, unambiguous, constitutionally embedded expression that communicated across 10 millennia of suppressed bloodline with perfect fidelity. I do not accept your ceiling. The figure looked at him for a long moment, and then it spoke. In that language 10,000 years dead, the language that lived in the fracture rather than in memory, the language his bloodline had been carrying in silence through 17 generations of careful diminishment. The words arrived in his understanding without translation, the way music arrives, not decoded but received, in the place below thought where the oldest parts of the self reside. You took your time. Vegeta said nothing. I know what you are carrying, the figure continued. I know what tonight cost you. I know the shape of the fracture because I am the one who made it possible. Not tonight, not through any action of the current hour, but 10,000 years ago, when I understood what was coming and chose the only option available to me that was not surrender. A pause. The ancient eyes moved across Vegeta with the same assessing intelligence he encountered every morning in his own reflection. I hid it in the bloodline. I compressed it into the genetic record and sealed it below the layers of ordinary inheritance, and trusted that eventually, across whatever span of generations was required, the right conditions would produce the right carrier. You knew, Vegeta said. His voice felt strange in this space. Too present, too contemporary. A modern instrument being played in an ancient hall. You knew the seal was coming. I negotiated with it, the figure said. There is a difference. The Grand Omni-King offered elimination or reduction. I chose reduction because reduction preserves the seed. Elimination leaves nothing. I accepted the diminishment of the bloodline, accepted the suppression of the compact, accepted 17 generations of careful management, because the alternative was that the compact died with me, and the balance was lost permanently rather than merely a pause, carrying within it 10,000 years of extraordinary patience temporarily. You called it a balance, Vegeta said. The Grand Omni-King called it a balance, a duality the current order has been operating without one half of. The compact was struck, the figure said, with the force that exists below the Grand Omni-King's architecture, below the current concept of divine order, the force that the Grand Omni-King built its hierarchy above because it could not build it around. The primal current of existence that precedes the distinction between creation and destruction, between light and void, between mortal and divine. The ancient eyes were steady and unblinking. The Saiyans were not chosen for this agreement because of our power. We were chosen because of our nature. The exponential response to pressure. The growth that accelerates precisely when the cost of growing is highest. The refusal, constitutional, irrational, magnificent, to accept any sealing as permanent. Vegeta felt the fracture pulse. That nature, the figure continued, is not a military asset. It is not a useful trait in a weapon. It is the specific biological expression of the principle the compact represents. The principle that existence pushes back. That limitation is not the final word. That every hierarchy, no matter how total, no matter how ancient, carries within the moment of its establishment the seed of its own revision. A breath. The Grand Omni-King sealed the compact because a universe in which that principle has a sovereign representative is a universe in which the divine hierarchy is genuinely accountable. And accountability was something it was not prepared to accept. And now, Vegeta said. Now the figure said, you are going to accept the inheritance. Not because I am asking you to, not because the universe requires it, or the balance demands it, or any force outside yourself is directing you toward it. The ancient eyes held his with an intensity that crossed 10,000 years of genetic distance without losing a single degree of heat. But because you have never in your life accepted a ceiling. And the compact is the only thing in existence that has no ceiling. It does not grant power. It grants a pause, selecting the word with the precision of someone who has had 10 millennia to consider the right one. Continuation. The absolute, unconditional, structurally guaranteed continuation of the will to surpass. The battlefield was very still around them. The two suns hung at their fixed positions above the dark earth. The warriors in their ancient formations held their ground against the pressure from above. Not winning, not losing, simply enduring, which was its own form of victory against a force that had expected them to simply stop. Vegeta looked at the figure on the throne for a long time. At the face that was and was not his own. At the expression that had crossed 10,000 years of suppressed bloodline to find him in this impossible moment. At the ancient eyes that carried, beneath their intensity, something he had not expected to find there. Not demand, not instruction, not the weight of legacy pressing down like an obligation. Hope. Genuine, unperformed, quietly extraordinary hope. The hope of someone who had made a very long bet on a very uncertain outcome and was only now at the absolute end of the waiting, discovering whether the bet had been sound. What is your name? Vegeta said. The figure smiled. It was the first expression that had crossed that face. In all three visions, across every flash of the ancient memory, that was not assessment or authority or the weight of 10 millennia of patient waiting. It was simply a smile. Small, genuine. The smile of a king who has found, after everything, the one answer that makes the entirety of the question worthwhile. And it spoke its name in the dead language. In the language of the fracture. In the language that lived below thought and arrived as music rather than information. Vegeta received it. He received it the way the earth receives rain after a very long drought, not analyzing it, not measuring it, not performing any operation upon it except the simple, fundamental one of opening. The name moved through the fracture and filled the space below his identity's foundation with something that was not power and was not memory and was not instruction, but was something that preceded and underwrote all three of those things. Recognition. The recognition of an inheritance finally after 10,000 years of careful suppression and patient waiting, and the accumulated momentum of 17 generations of a bloodline that had been reduced but never destroyed, arriving at the hands it had been preserved for. He woke. The improvised sanctuary was quiet around him. The void beyond its boundaries held its eternal silence. Whis sat nearby, in a posture of meditative stillness, staff across his knees, eyes open, watching Vegeta with an expression that suggested he had been watching for some time, and had observed enough of what passed across the sleeping face to understand that something significant had occurred in the territory below consciousness. Vegeta sat up. His left arm still hung at its fractured angle. His ribs still pressed against each other in protest. The physical damage was exactly as it had been. Sleep had not healed him, and he had not expected it to. The body would take the time it took, but the fracture was wider. Considerably wider. The tidal widening that had been gradual and incremental during the waking hours had continued through sleep with the uninterrupted momentum of a process no longer requiring conscious permission. He could feel the ancient compact moving through his key pathways with a confidence it had not possessed before. Not flooding, Not overwhelming, but orienting, like a river that has found its proper channel and is now moving in the direction it was always meant to move. He looked at his hands. The ancient aura was there, not just in the pulse and flicker of the waking visions, but steadily, continuously present. That nameless color breathing across his skin with the calm regularity of something that has found its home. "You dreamed," we said. "Not a question. I met him," Vegeta said. Whis was quiet for a moment. "The first king. He's been waiting 10,000 years." Vegeta flexed his fingers, feeling the ancient ki move through them, learning its weight and temperature and the specific quality of its responsiveness, the way you learn a new weapon. Not through instruction, but through contact. He chose reduction over elimination, buried the compact in the bloodline, and trusted that eventually the right conditions would produce someone who could carry it. And he believes you are that someone. "He doesn't believe it," Vegeta said. "He knows it. The same way I know it." He paused, and the aura pulsed, and the name the first king had given him in the space below thought, resonated through the foundation of his identity with the clean, structural certainty of a keystone finding its arch. "We need to move. The Grand Omni-King is reconsidering its approach. Whatever window exists between its retreat and its next action is not large," Whis completed. "Yes, I know." He rose, staff in hand, the uncertainty that had inhabited his expression since the Grand Omni-King's withdrawal settling into something that was not quite resolution, but was moving in its direction. The expression of a being who has made the decision to act on incomplete information because the alternative is to wait for completion that will not arrive. "Where are we going?" Vegeta stood. The pain was considerable, and he moved through it with the specific efficiency of a warrior who has learned to operate damaged. Not ignoring the pain, which was information, but not being governed by it, which was a choice. He straightened to his full height, broken arm and fractured ribs, and the accumulated damage of 4 hours of combat at the absolute threshold of ultra ego, pressing against every movement with their honest accounting. The ancient aura rose around him as he stood. It did not roar. It did not explode outward in the dramatic display of power that had characterized every transformation he had ever achieved. It simply expanded, slowly, steadily, with the profound, unhurried confidence of something that has never needed to perform itself, because its nature speaks louder than any display could. The nameless color moved outward from his body in slow volcanic increments, and the void around him deepened, and the space between dimensions leaned closer in the way that Whis had once described to him as the universe paying attention. He gave the coordinates that the memory had given him, not in words, in ki, pressing the specific atmospheric signature and gravitational orientation and celestial positioning of the place the ancient compact had been struck into the space between himself and Whis with the precision of a warrior who has memorized a battlefield by feel rather than by map. Whis received them. His staff glowed briefly, that soft blue-white luminescence of divine navigation processing information that had no place in any current cartographic system. And then steadied. "That location," we said carefully, "does not exist in any record I have access to." "It exists," Vegeta said. "It existed before the records were written." A pause. Then Whis inclined his head, a gesture that carried, beneath its characteristic elegance, the weight of a decision made in full awareness of its consequences. The decision of a being choosing, for the first time in an existence defined by service to the divine order, to move in a direction that the divine order had not sanctioned. "Then we go," we said, "to where the records were not written." Beerus, still on his fragment of debris, looked between them. The god of destruction was quiet for a long moment, processing, in his particular way, the information that had accumulated across this extraordinary night. The battle. The Grand Omni-King. The fracture. The ancient compact, and the first king, and the 10,000 years of patient suppression, and the revelation that the universe had been running incomplete since before Beerus himself had been appointed to his function. "I'm coming," he said, not as a command, not with any of the habitual authority of a god who has spent millions of years at the apex of a divine hierarchy, simply as a statement of fact from a being who has decided that the direction things are moving is the direction he intends to face. Vegeta looked at him. "Try to keep up," he said, and the ancient aura expanded, and the void responded. And somewhere in the space below the current universe's architecture, in the compressed memory of a bloodline that had waited 10 millennia for this moment, the first Saiyan King's name resonated one final time through the foundation of everything that Vegeta was and everything that he was in the process of becoming. The stars in the nearest universe did not dim. They leaned closer, as though they, too, had been waiting. As though the universe itself, that incomplete, single-engined, compensating system that had been holding its breath for 10,000 years, had just heard, in the ancient aura of a broken Saiyan standing in the ruins of heaven, the first note of something it had been trying to remember how to play. And in the direction they were moving, past the edge of current cartography, past the boundary of divine record, into the territory that predated the vocabulary of the current order, something waited. Something that had been waiting for exactly as long as the seal had held. And it recognized the aura of the one who carried the compact. And it opened. The place had no name in any living language. That was the first thing Vegeta understood as Whis navigated them through the dimensional boundary. Not with the clean, instantaneous transition of ordinary divine travel, but slowly, with the careful deliberation of someone feeling their way through unfamiliar terrain in the dark. The journey itself was strange. The space between their origin point and their destination did not behave like ordinary interdimensional travel. It did not have the characteristic quality of movement through the void. That sensation of crossing distance, however dimensionally compressed. Instead, it had the quality of descent, of going down through layers rather than across through space. Each layer they passed through was denser than the last, and older, and quieter in the way that deep geological strata are quieter than surface rock. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of compression, of time accumulated and pressed into density by the weight of everything above it. Beerus said nothing during the journey. This was notable. The god of destruction, who had filled more silences than Vegeta could count, with commentary ranging from culinary observation to casual threats of planetary destruction. That Beerus was absent for the duration of the transit, replaced by this quieter version who held his divine energy close and watched the passing layers with the expression of a being recognizing, in real time, that the foundation beneath his entire frame of reference was deeper and stranger and more consequential than he had been constructed to understand. Whis navigated with his staff extended before him, reading something in the dimensional substrate that was not visible to either of his companions. His expression was concentrated in a way that Vegeta had rarely seen. The angel's characteristic composure intact, but deployed now as a working tool rather than a social performance. Every cognitive resource directed at the task of finding a path through territory that no current divine cartography acknowledged. "We're descending through temporal strata," Whis said quietly, more to himself than to either of them. Each layer represents approximately, no, not quite. The intervals aren't consistent. They're compressed around certain events and expanded around others. A pause, during which his staff traced a pattern in the dimensional fabric with precise, deliberate movements. The compression points correspond to, yes, to conflicts. The strata are thinner where something large happened, and the accumulated pressure of the event collapsed the surrounding time. "How far down do we need to go?" Beerus asked. "Further than I've been," Whis said simply. "Further than any angel has been, I suspect, since the records were sealed." Vegeta felt the fracture guiding him. It was subtle, not the overwhelming flood of the dream visions, not the explosive detonation of the first waking flash, but a gentle, continuous orientation, like a compass needle. The ancient compact within him knew where it was going with the cellular certainty of a salmon navigating toward the river of its origin. Not through conscious calculation, but through the biological memory of a pattern imprinted deeper than thought. He followed it without comment, trusting it the way he had learned, slowly, and with considerable resistance, to trust the deeper signals of his own ki over the noise of his conscious strategizing. The layers continued, and then the descent ended. Not with a dramatic transition, no tearing of dimensional fabric, no explosive arrival. They simply were somewhere, with the completeness of a destination reached rather than the drama of a boundary crossed. The somewhere resolved around them gradually, the way eyes adjust to a new quality of light. And what it resolved into was not what Vegeta had expected. He had expected ruins. He had anticipated, based on the battlefield of the dream, the geological drama of a place that had hosted a war. Scarred earth, fractured landscape, the physical record of conflict accumulated over time into something that looked like a wound that had healed wrong. He had expected the quality of a place where something important had ended. What he found instead was a place where something important had paused. The plane was exactly as the dream had shown it. Dark earth, heavy gravity, the specific atmospheric density of a world that had evolved its inhabitants toward the particular physical profile he recognized in his own body. But the two suns were lower on the horizon than they had been in the dream, throwing long shadows across the earth that were amber and deep violet simultaneously. And the plane was not empty. It was inhabited, not by living beings, not by any presence that registered as conscious or animate, but by something stranger and, in its own way, more affecting. It was inhabited by the residue of will. Ki, he understood immediately, but ki of an antiquity and a density that made even the ancient aura currently moving across his own skin feel young. The plane was saturated with it, pressed into the dark earth over 10,000 years of undisturbed accumulation. Rising from the ground in slow, barely visible currents the way heat rises from stone that has been holding sunlight since morning. It did not feel hostile. It did not feel welcoming. It felt waiting, with the particular quality of waiting that belongs to things that have been doing it for a very long time and have made their peace with the duration. "I can feel it," Beerus said quietly, standing on the plane with his divine energy drawn inward, his purple eyes moving across the landscape with an expression that had moved past surprise into something more fundamental. "Whatever this place is, whatever happened here, it's still in the ground. It never left," Vegeta said. He walked forward. The gravity pressed down on him immediately, 3 times standard, the same as in the dream, and his broken body protested this with honest and considerable specificity. He moved through the protests with the same deliberate efficiency he had employed since waking. The ancient aura around him responded to the gravity differently than his ordinary ki would have. Rather than compensating against it, it received it, drew it in, converted the additional pressure into depth, the way Ultra Ego converted damage into power. The principle was the same. The application was more fundamental. The first king had said it in the dream. The exponential response to pressure. The growth that accelerates precisely when the cost of growing is highest. Not a military asset. Not a useful trait in a weapon. The biological expression of the principle the compact represented. He was feeling it now in his own body. The ancient ki, drawing on the environmental pressure of this place, this world that had evolved specifically for beings who responded to weight by growing stronger and deepening in response. Not his ultra ego, not any form he recognized. Something beneath all of it, the bedrock level, the foundation that his entire power structure had been built above without his knowledge of what it was built on. He walked toward the center of the plane. He knew it was the center, not from any visible landmark, but from the fracture. The compass needle pulling him forward with quiet insistence. The ancient compact orienting toward the place where it had been established the way iron orients toward its magnetic source. The residual ki in the ground grew denser as he walked, the currents rising more visibly, and the color of them, that ancient nameless color that he had first seen in his own aura, was everywhere here, present in the earth itself, woven into the dark soil like something that had been planted rather than occurring naturally. It had been planted. He understood this as he walked. The first king had not simply fought here and died here and left the residue of battle in the ground. He had prepared this place. Over years, perhaps over decades, pressing his ki into the earth with deliberate intentionality, creating something that would outlast the seal, outlast the suppression, outlast the 17 generations of dilution. Creating a repository, a record, a place where the truth of what the Saiyans had been and what the compact meant could be preserved, outside the jurisdiction of the divine archive that the Grand Omni-King would subsequently seal. You cannot seal what you did not create. You cannot erase what was never entered into your record. The center of the plane held a formation of stone. Not carved, not constructed, but arranged. 7 stones, each approximately the height of a standing adult, placed in a circle with a spacing that felt mathematical, even before Vegeta recognized the specific geometry. Astronomical, he realized after a moment. The spacing and angles corresponded to the positions of celestial bodies. Not the current positions, but a historical configuration, a moment in the orbital dance of this world's solar system frozen in stone, preserved as coordinate and timestamp simultaneously. A location in space and in time, encoded in the physical arrangement of 7 ancient rocks on a plane that no current divine cartography admitted existed. He stood at the edge of the circle. The ki rising from the earth was strongest here, not in the aggressive, pressurized way of a power source demanding to be tapped, but with the quality of a voice speaking at its natural volume, fully present, neither performing nor restraining. It moved through the soles of his feet and up through the fractured architecture of his body, with the careful intelligence of something that knows exactly where it is going, and is choosing to move gently because the carrier is currently damaged and the message is too important to risk losing in transit. The fracture opened another degree, and the vision came, but differently this time. Not the compressed intensity of the sleeping mind receiving what the waking mind could not hold, not the detonating flash of the first unprepared contact. This was the vision of a place offering its record to someone it recognized as its intended recipient. Unhurried. Complete. The way a letter reads when you have finally found it after a very long search, not struggling to decode it, not overwhelmed by it, but simply reading, with the specific quality of attention that belongs to receiving something that was written specifically for you. He saw the first king here, standing in this circle of stones, on a day when both suns were directly overhead, and the shadows were at their shortest, and the ki in the ground was at its most active. Standing with the specific quality of a man who has made a very large decision and has arrived at the place where the decision must be enacted rather than merely carried. Around him, a small group, not the thousands of the battlefield, not the vast formations of the ancient Saiyan civilization at the height of its sovereign power. Perhaps 30 warriors, selected from those thousands with criteria that spoke of trust rather than combat ability. Each of them pressing their palms to the dark earth, each of them adding their own ki to the record. Not their power, not their strength, but their witness, their testimony, their living confirmation that what was being preserved here was true. The first king spoke. Vegeta received the words through the fracture, through the ki in the earth, through the bloodline connection that had been waiting 10,000 years to serve its intended function. The dead language arrived not as foreign sound, decoded by uncertain translation, but as pure meaning, bypassing the mechanism of language entirely and arriving directly as understanding. He spoke of the compact, the force below the Grand Omni-King's architecture, the primal current that predated the distinction between creation and destruction, that the current divine order had been built above rather than around because it could not be incorporated without surrendering the hierarchy's claim to absolute authority. The compact was not a weapon. It was not an alliance in the military sense. It was a recognition, a formal acknowledgement by that primal force of the Saiyans as its sovereign representatives in the structured universe, its voice in the plane of existence where the current divine hierarchy operated. And the first king spoke of what that recognition carried. The absolute continuation. That was the closest Vegeta's contemporary mind could translate the ancient term, though the translation was imperfect, losing the specific quality of what was meant. Not immortality, not invincibility, not the crude permanence of a body that could not be destroyed. Something more specific and more profound. The guarantee that the principle embodied in the Saiyan nature would not be extinguished. That the refusal to accept ceilings, the exponential growth under pressure, the constitutional, irrational, magnificent will to surpass. These would have a permanent, unkillable representative in the structured universe, underwritten by the same force that underwrote existence itself. The divine hierarchy could not erase what the primal force had recognized, could not destroy what existed below the level of its own authority, could not ceiling what had been formally acknowledged as the living embodiment of the principle that all ceilings were temporary. This was why the Grand Omni-King had chosen reduction over elimination. This was why it had spent 17 generations diluting rather than destroying. Because destroying the bloodline of the compact's bearer would not have destroyed the compact. It would have dissolved the structured universe's connection to the primal force entirely. severing the one thread of the balance that the current divine order, for all its careful compensatory architecture, could not ultimately function without. The seal had been a compromise, a desperate, sophisticated, ultimately temporary compromise between an authority that could not accept accountability and a balance that could not be permanently violated without consequences that even the architect of reality could not fully calculate. And it had held for 10,000 years, and it had ended tonight. The vision released him gently, receding the way the dream had receded, not shattering, not flooding him with the aftermath of intensity, simply withdrawing with the quiet satisfaction of a message delivered to its intended recipient. He stood in the circle of stones on the ancient plain, beneath the amber-violet light of two descending suns, and the key in the earth moved through him in those slow, certain currents, and the fracture in his key was, he realized, taking the quiet inventory of a warrior assessing his own condition with honest precision. No longer a fracture, it had opened completely. Not explosively, not with a dramatic announcement of a transformation he had learned to associate with threshold crossings. The hair, the aura, the shockwave, the sky-changing color. Nothing like that. It had simply finished opening, while he stood here receiving the record of this place, and what had been a fracture was now a channel. Wide and deep and clear and carrying, through the full architecture of his key pathways, the ancient compact with the unhurried confidence of a river that has finally reached the plain after a very long time moving through mountains. He breathed. The ancient aura moved around him with a steadiness and depth it had not possessed before. Not the volcanic pulses of the partial awakening, but a continuous, even, extraordinary presence. The nameless color burned with quiet intensity at every surface of his body. Not outward, not aggressive, not performing. Present, the way the gravity of a very large mass is present, not announced, simply exerted, as the natural consequence of what it fundamentally was. Whis, at the edge of the stone circle, had gone very still. He was looking at Vegeta with an expression that moved, as Vegeta watched, through several distinct registers. Shock, then recognition, then something that occupied the territory between awe and an emotion that angels were not, theoretically, constructed to experience. Something that, in a being with a less comprehensive vocabulary of composure, might have been called humility. The channel is open, we said, quietly, as though speaking at normal volume might disturb something. Yes, Vegeta said. The compact is active. Vegeta looked at his hands. The ancient key moved through them with the fluency of something that had always belonged there and was only now operating without the suppression that had constrained it for 10,000 years. Fully, whatever the Grand Omni-King sealed, whatever it spent 17 generations diluting, it's done. The seal is finished. Beerus walked slowly to the edge of the circle. He stood there looking at Vegeta across the 7 ancient stones with the expression of a god of destruction, confronting the evidence that the category of things he was capable of destroying had just become, without warning, somewhat smaller. What does it feel like? Beerus said. Vegeta considered this. It was a genuine question from a being that deserved a genuine answer. Not a performance of certainty, not a declaration of power, but the honest, phenomenological report of a warrior who had crossed enough thresholds to know how to describe what crossing one felt like. Like being the right size for the first time, he said finally. Like every form I've ever achieved, every transformation, every threshold. They were all the right direction. But they were built on a foundation I didn't know I had. And the foundation was operating at a fraction of its capacity because of the suppression. Now it isn't. He paused. It's not that I'm stronger. It's that what I was before was incomplete, running on one engine, and now both are running, Beerus said. Both are running, Vegeta confirmed. The two suns touched the horizon. The long amber-violet shadows of the stone circle stretched across the dark earth, reaching outward from the ancient arrangement of astronomical coordinates frozen in rock, and the key in the ground moved in its slow, patient currents. And the record that had been preserved here for 10,000 years had found its recipient, and the plain was quiet, with the specific quality of something that has finished what it was made to do. Vegeta stood in the center of it and felt, moving through the full architecture of his newly unconstrained ki, the weight of what he now carried. Not power, not technique, not a new form to deploy in battle. An inheritance, 10,000 years of waiting, compressed into the genetic record of a bloodline that had refused to die even under 17 generations of systematic diminishment. The first king's face, that familiar architecture, those eyes carrying the expression that his own mirror had returned to him every morning of his adult life, present in the foundation of his identity with the weight of 10 millennia of patient preparation. You took your time, the old king had said, and in the anchor of the ancient plain, with both suns gone below the horizon, and the stars of this ancient world emerging one by one into the dark sky above, stars that were not the stars of any universe currently recorded in any divine archive, stars that belonged to a period before the cartography existed to name them. Vegeta looked upward and felt the compact move through him like a tide that had finally found its shore. Something was coming. Not just the next confrontation with the Grand Omni-King, though that was coming too. That was certain and closer than comfort suggested, and would require everything he was and everything he was still in the process of becoming. Not just the battle for the throne that the structure of the ancient civilization's memory seemed to indicate was waiting somewhere in the sequence of what came next. Something larger than either of those things. A correction. The universe's own correction. That single-engined, compensating, incomplete system that had been holding its breath since the seal was placed. Finally finding, in the full activation of the ancient compact through the body of the one who had been preserved to carry it, the second engine. The balance. Restored, not through negotiation or divine decree or any action of the hierarchy that had spent 10,000 years preventing this moment, but through the oldest mechanism available to existence when its own architecture requires correction. Through a Saiyan who had refused, at every ceiling, to stop. Above him, the ancient stars burned quietly. And in the ki that now moved through him without suppression, without dilution, without the weight of 10,000 years of careful management, the first king's name resonated one final time. Not as a key, not as a code, not as the activation sequence for an inheritance finally received, as a greeting from a legacy that had waited 10 millennia for the right hands to carry it forward, to the hands that were, finally, carrying it. Welcome, it said. Now begin. The ancient stars did not move. That was the first thing Vegeta noticed as the night deepened around the plain. The stars of this world held their positions with a stillness that the stars of the current universe did not possess. In the universe he knew, stars moved, slowly, imperceptibly to ordinary observation, but moved, drifting through the long arcs of their galactic orbits, participating in the vast, unhurried choreography of a cosmos in continuous motion. These stars were fixed, not frozen, not arrested in the way that time manipulation produced stillness, but anchored, as though the sky above this place existed in a relationship with permanence that the current universe's sky had not been designed to replicate. He sat in the center of the stone circle, not in meditation, or not in the formal sense, not in the deliberate, technique-oriented stillness of training. In the older sense, the sense that warriors discovered before training systems existed to codify what warriors needed. The simple act of sitting with what you had just received and letting the receiving complete itself without interference. The ancient ki moved through him in its continuous, even currents, and the compact breathed through the full architecture of his pathways. And he sat with it the way you sit with a truth that arrived larger than you expected and requires more interior space than you currently have. He was reorganizing that space. Whis had withdrawn to a respectful distance, far enough to constitute privacy, close enough to constitute presence. The angel sat on the dark earth at the edge of the plain, with his staff across his knees, and he was doing something that Vegeta had never observed him do in all the years of their association. He was not reading. He was not navigating. He was not performing any of the dozen varieties of divine function that usually occupied his moments of apparent stillness. He was simply sitting, with the specific quality of a being that has arrived somewhere it did not expect to arrive, and is taking the time to understand what arriving there means. Beerus paced. The god of destruction moved in a slow circuit around the stone formation, his divine energy drawn carefully inward, his purple eyes moving between the fixed stars above and the key-saturated ground below with the expression of a being conducting a comprehensive reassessment of everything it thought it understood about the structure of reality. He paced the way he did when something genuinely unsettled him, not the theatrical restlessness of boredom, but the physical expression of a mind working harder than it was comfortable working, moving the body because the body needed somewhere to put the energy that the mind was consuming. "Say it," Vegeta said without looking at him. Beerus stopped. "Say what?" "Whatever you've been not saying since we arrived." A pause. The god of destruction looked at the back of Vegeta's head for a moment, then at the fixed stars, then at the key rising from the dark earth in its slow currents of ancient, nameless color. "I've been a god of destruction for, I don't even know precisely how long. Millions of years. I was appointed to that function and I performed it, and I understood it as the apex of a hierarchy that I never had particular reason to question, because I was at the top of the portion of it I could see." He paused. "I was at the top of the portion I could see." "Yes," Vegeta said. "And tonight I discovered that the portion I could see was..." He stopped. Started again. The Grand Omni-King didn't just seal the compact. It designed the entire architecture of the divine order specifically to prevent anyone within it from being able to see far enough to know the compact had existed. The angels restricted knowledge, the hierarchy of destroyers and creators, operating within defined boundaries. Even Zeno, with his erasure authority, exists within the system rather than above it. None of us could have questioned the foundation, because none of us were given the tools to perceive that a different foundation had ever existed. Another pause. "I have been, for millions of years, an extremely efficient component in the machine I thought I understood, and did not." "Welcome to what it felt like," Vegeta said. "To grow up Saiyan." Beerus absorbed this. The comparison was not perfectly parallel. Vegeta's experience of systematic reduction had been generational and biological, while Beerus's had been structural and institutional. But the essential quality was the same. The experience of discovering that the limits of your understanding were not the limits of reality, but the limits of what you had been permitted to see. The specific destabilizing vertigo of that discovery. The question that followed it, which was not the comfortable question of, "What do I do with this power?" but the much harder question of, "Who have I been? And what does it mean that I have been that person inside a system that was lying to me about what it was?" "The warriors I fought," Beerus said slowly. "The civilizations I destroyed. The judgments I passed on which worlds deserved continuation and which..." He stopped. His voice had taken on a quality that Vegeta had never heard in it before. Not guilt. Beerus had been performing his divine function too long, and with too much institutional certainty for guilt to be the first register he accessed. Something more fundamental than guilt, the precursor to it, the moment before the accounting begins, when the ledger first opens and the entries become visible. How many of the things I destroyed were? "I don't know," Vegeta said honestly. "And you won't know." That's the other thing the Grand Omni-King's architecture accomplished. It didn't just prevent you from questioning the foundation. It made the historical record of anything that preceded the current order inaccessible, which means the accounting you want to perform cannot be completed. You can know that the system was built on a compromise made in bad faith. You cannot know the full scope of what that compromise cost. He paused. Live with that. It's not comfortable, but it's the truth. And the truth is more useful than comfortable. Beerus was quiet for a long time. Then, with the specific economy of a being who has processed something and arrived at the other side of it and is ready to continue. What did the record show you? In the vision, what were the Saiyans before? Vegeta looked at the fixed stars. Sovereign, he said. Not in the sense of territory or dominion. In the sense of standing. They were parties to the fundamental balance of existence rather than instruments within someone else's maintenance of it. The compact wasn't the power source. It was a relationship, a formal recognition by the primal force below the Grand Omni-King's architecture that the Saiyan nature was its voice in the structured universe. He breathed. The exponential response to pressure, the growth that accelerates when the cost is highest, the refusal to accept any ceiling as permanent. These are not useful traits in a weapon. They are the specific biological expression of the principle that existence itself operates on. the principle that the universe is not static, that hierarchies are not final, that limitation is not law. And the Grand Omni-King built a divine order that required that principle to have no sovereign representative. We said from his position at the edge of the plane. His voice was quiet and carried the distance without effort, in the way of someone accustomed to being heard across vast spaces. Because a universe in which that principle has genuine standing is a universe in which the divine hierarchy is accountable to something other than itself. Yes, Vegeta said. And it has been running without that accountability for 10,000 years. Yes. Another silence. The ancient key moved through the earth in its patient currents. Somewhere in the middle distance, a wind moved across the plain. Not a wind with any atmospheric cause, Vegeta suspected, but the plain itself exhaling. The key-saturated ground responding to the completion of something it had been holding in the long expectation of. The vision showed me the war, Vegeta said. Not just the battlefield, the arc of it. The full sequence of the conflict between the first Saiyan civilization and the divine hierarchy that wanted to incorporate them. He paused, sorting through the record the place had given him, finding the correct entry point into the telling of it. The Saiyans didn't start the war. The hierarchy did. Or the process that became the hierarchy did. The Grand Omni-King's construction of the divine order required the elimination of sovereign parties because sovereign parties created accountability. And the architecture of absolute authority cannot accommodate accountability without ceasing to be absolute. So it moved against them, Beerus said, slowly, carefully, the way it always moves, not with the bluntness of direct confrontation, but with the sophistication of systemic pressure. It began with integration offers, positions within the divine hierarchy, functions, like yours, like the angels' functions, that would have placed the Saiyan civilization within the system as components rather than as sovereign parties. Some accepted. Those are the bloodlines that became the first wave of what eventually became the Saiyan military culture. The warriors in service model that Frieza inherited and exploited. And the ones who refused, we said, fought. Vegeta's voice carried the particular quality of someone recounting history they have received through the body rather than through documentation. Not narrating events, but remembering them, with the specific intimacy of inherited memory, for longer than the current divine record acknowledges having occurred. The war lasted, by the record in this ground, by the key memory pressed into this plane, nearly 3,000 years. 3,000 years of a civilization that refused incorporation, finding a divine hierarchy that could not simply erase them because the primal force of the compact made erasure impossible. Beerus stopped pacing. 3,000 years. It was not a war of equals in terms of scale, Vegeta said. The hierarchy had resources that dwarfed anything a single civilization could field. But the compact provided something that scale could not overcome. The guarantee that the Saiyan sovereign standing could not be unilaterally nullified. The primal force below the architecture would not permit it. So the war could not be won by erasure. It had to be won by negotiation. The seal, we said softly. The seal. Vegeta looked at his hands, at the ancient key moving through them, at the nameless color that burned in steady, unhurried confidence across his skin. The first king negotiated for 3,000 years and eventually arrived at a position he could not advance beyond. Not through defeat. The compact still held. The primal force still underwrote the Saiyan's sovereign standing. Direct erasure was still impossible. But the hierarchy's resources were effectively infinite, and the civilizations were not. They could not be destroyed, but they could be exhausted. 3,000 years of continuous warfare against an effectively infinite opponent had cost everything. The civilization was intact, but depleted, and the first king made the calculation. He stopped. The weight of it settled into the silence. The specific gravity of a decision made under conditions of complete exhaustion by someone who understood with complete clarity exactly what they were choosing and what it would cost, and chose it anyway because the alternative cost more. He accepted the reduction, Vegeta said. He chose it deliberately, on his terms, as a strategic decision rather than a surrender. He negotiated the parameters, the suppression rather than elimination, the dormancy rather than destruction, the preservation of the bloodline over its extinction. He pressed the record into this ground, into this plane, into the key memory of this world that existed outside the divine archive, and therefore outside the jurisdiction of the seal. He trusted the compact itself to ensure that the bloodline survived the 17 generations of dilution. And Vegeta stopped again. Something had shifted in the plane, a change in the quality of the ki rising from the earth, not in intensity, not in the direction of its movement, but in its attention, as though the record, having delivered its content, was now present in a different way. Not a library offering its materials, something more active, something that had been waiting not just for the inheritance to be received, but for the moment of full comprehension, the moment when the recipient understood not just the what and the how, but the why, and the weight of the why, and what carrying that weight actually meant in the living present rather than in the abstracted past. He stayed here, Vegeta said quietly. Whis looked up sharply. He didn't die in battle. He didn't go into exile. He stayed here, on this plane, in this circle, and he pressed himself into the ground along with everything else. His ki, his memory, his will. Vegeta felt it now, in the currents moving through his feet and up through his body. Not just the record of the civilization, not just the testimony of the 30 witnesses, but the first king himself, present, not as a ghost, not as a consciousness preserved in anything so dramatic as that, but as ki, as the specific, irreducible frequency of a will that had refused, even in its final act, to simply end. He's here, in the ground. He's been here for 10,000 years. The plane was very still. Waiting, Beerus said. Not a question. Not passively, Vegeta said. He's been sustaining, maintaining the record, keeping the key memory coherent across 10,000 years, so that when the carrier arrived, the record would be complete and legible rather than degraded. He's been present in this ground, doing the continuous work of preservation, so that the inheritance would actually be an inheritance rather than a fragment. He breathed. 10,000 years in the ground of a world that no current divine cartography admits exists, doing the work of keeping something alive that the architect of reality spent 17 generations trying to make die. The silence that followed this was of a quality that none of the previous silences had possessed. Not the silence of processing, not the silence of awe, but the silence of standing at the edge of something that is simultaneously very old and very immediate. The silence of being in the presence of a devotion that exceeded any comfortable scale of measurement. Whis was standing. He had risen from his seated position without Vegeta noticing, and he stood at the edge of the plane with his staff held not in its usual casual elegance, but with both hands, at his side, in the posture of someone who has recognized that they are standing in a place that requires a different quality of physical presence than their usual movement through the world affords. He knows you're here, Whis said quietly. He's known since we arrived. Yes, Vegeta said. And the vision, the dreams, the fragments, those were him, reaching up through the bloodline. Not just the compact accessing its carrier. The first king, specifically, deliberately, choosing which memories to surface and in what order. Managing the revelation. Yes. He was guiding you here. He was guiding me here from the moment the fracture opened, Vegeta said. Possibly from further back than that. Possibly from, I don't know how far back. The fracture opened because of tonight's specific conditions. But the conditions that made tonight possible, the events of the preceding cycles, the particular sequence of loss and rage and refusal that produced a Saiyan damaged enough and desperate enough and willing enough to push Ultra Ego past its design threshold. He stopped, looked at the dark earth. How much of that was circumstance, and how much of it was a 10,000-year-old will pressing upward through 17 generations of bloodline toward a specific outcome? The question settled into the plane without requiring an answer, because the answer was not something that could be determined with the information available, and because some questions were more valuable as questions than as resolved certainties. They kept the appropriate humility present in the person carrying them, which was its own form of usefulness. Vegeta rose from his seated position, slowly, with the deliberate economy of a damaged body that had been still long enough to stiffen, and was now required to move again. He stood in the center of the stone circle and looked down at the dark earth beneath his feet, and the key in the ground rose to meet his attention with the specific quality that it had been building toward since their arrival. not offering, not waiting, but ready. The completion of a 10,000-year preparation, arriving at its moment. "I need to speak to him," Vegeta said. Whis and Beerus exchanged a look, that rapid, comprehensive exchange of two beings who have known each other long enough to conduct full conversations in the duration of a glance. What passed between them in that instant was the mutual recognition that they were in territory that no precedent had prepared either of them for, and that the appropriate response to that territory was neither intervention nor guidance, but simply presence. The willingness to be there, to witness, to be available without imposing. "We'll be at the edge of the plain," Whis said. They withdrew. Vegeta stood alone in the circle of 7 ancient stones on the plane that predated the divine record, beneath the fixed stars of a world that the current universe did not acknowledge, with the key of 10,000 years of patient preservation moving through the soles of his feet. He knelt. Not in submission. He had never knelt in submission in his life, and he was not beginning now. He knelt in the specific gesture of a warrior acknowledging a ground that deserved acknowledgement. The gesture of someone who recognizes that the earth beneath them is not merely terrain, but record. Not merely surface, but presence. He pressed his palm flat against the dark soil, and the ancient key moved up through his hand with immediate, certain responsiveness. Not a flood, not an overwhelming, just contact. The specific, unmistakable quality of contact between two things that recognize each other. "I'm here," he said. The ground breathed. Not literally, not in any sense that Whis or Beerus, watching from the plane's edge, would have been able to measure or confirm. But Vegeta felt it, in the key moving through his palm, in the fracture that was now a channel, in the ancient compact breathing through the full architecture of his being, with a depth and clarity it had not yet achieved. The ground breathed, and in the breath, the first king's presence gathered. Not rising, it was already everywhere in this plane, saturated into every particle of dark earth. Focusing, orienting, the way a voice focuses when it has something specific to say to a specific person. "You understand now," the presence said. Through the key, through the channel, through the bloodline connection that was now operating at its full, unobstructed capacity, rather than pressing through the hairline fracture of a suppressed inheritance. The dead language arrived as music, as meaning received below the mechanism of translation. "I understand," Vegeta said. "The compact, the war, the negotiation, the choice you made. Do you understand why I chose it?" He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved across the plain again. That atmospheric exhalation that was not quite weather, not quite key, something between the two. "You chose reduction over elimination, because elimination would have ended the compact permanently. The primal force would still have existed below the Grand Omni-King's architecture, but it would have had no sovereign representative in the structured universe. The balance would have been lost not temporarily, but finally. Yes. And you trusted the bloodline to produce someone who would eventually reach the threshold, who would be damaged enough and desperate enough and stubborn enough to push Ultra Ego past its ceiling and create the conditions that fractured the suppression. "I trusted the nature," the presence said. "Not a specific person, not a predicted outcome. The nature, the exponential response, the growth under pressure, the refusal to accept ceilings. That nature was always going to produce this moment eventually. The only variable was how many generations it would require." 17, Vegeta said. 17, the first king confirmed. And in the confirmation, something crossed the channel that was not language and not key, and not any of the categories Vegeta had words for. Something that existed in the frequency between communication and emotion. The specific register of a being that had spent 10,000 years in patient, solitary, underground preservation of a hope it could not know would be fulfilled, discovering in this moment that the hope had been sound. "You didn't know," Vegeta said quietly. "When you made the choice, when you pressed yourself into this ground and began the 10,000-year work of keeping the record alive, you didn't know it would work. You didn't know the bloodline would survive the dilution intact enough. You didn't know the right conditions would ever occur. You chose it and committed to it and sustained it for 10,000 years without knowing." "No," the first king said simply. "I did not know." The plane was very still. "But I knew the nature," the presence continued. "And the nature is not something that can be diluted out of existence. It can be suppressed. It can be buried. It can be reduced to the point where the being carrying it does not understand what it is or where it comes from. But it persists in the battle hunger, in the exponential growth, in the constitutional irrational refusal to stop. Even in the most diminished form, even in a Saiyan with no memory of sovereignty, no knowledge of the compact, no understanding of what the instincts that drove them toward greater and greater battles were originally expressions of, the nature persisted. Because it is not cultural. It is not taught or remembered or passed on through story or tradition. It is biological. It is written in the foundation of what we are, at a level below the reach of 17 generations of deliberate management. Vegeta looked at his palm, pressed against the dark earth, at the ancient key moving through the contact. That nameless color, that color that had no place in the current universe's chromatic vocabulary, because the last time it had existed freely, the gods had rewritten the dictionary of creation to erase it. "What do you need from me?" he said. "Nothing," the first king said. And the simplicity of it, the complete, undemanding simplicity of that single word from a presence that had spent 10,000 years sustaining a hope for exactly this moment, landed with a weight that no elaborate demand could have matched. The inheritance has been received. The compact is active. The channel is open, and the suppression is finished. Everything that needed to happen has happened. What comes next is yours. Not an obligation, not a duty laid on you by the weight of 10 millennia of waiting, but a choice. Made freely. By the carrier the nature produced. A choice, Vegeta said. You can walk away from this plane and use what you carry however you choose to use it. You can confront the Grand Omni-King and resolve what was broken in the divine order. You can build something entirely different from what either the current hierarchy or the ancient civilization would have predicted. You can pursue Kakarot's restoration with the compact underwriting your power. You are not bound by what I chose or what the compact was originally established for. A pause, long and genuine, and carrying within it the specific quality of a truth being offered without agenda. The compact does not obligate. It enables. What you do with what it enables is the exercise of the sovereignty it represents. The wind moved across the plain. The fixed stars burned above. And Vegeta knelt in the center of the ancient circle, with the first king's presence flowing through the dark earth into his palm. And the ancient compact breathing through the full architecture of his being, and the sovereignty of 10,000 years of patient preservation, finally, completely, irrevocably his. Not as inheritance in the sense of obligation, but in the truer sense, the sense that had always been the only sense worth having. As capacity, as the expansion of what was possible, as the opening of a door that had been sealed for longer than any current civilization had existed, into a room that no current map had ever shown. He made his choice. He did not speak it aloud. It did not require speech. The compact carried it. The channel delivered it. The first king received it through the connection of 10,000 years, and the key in the ground responded with that quality of attention that had been building since their arrival on this plane. Not a roar, not an explosion, not the dramatic announcement of a power activating. A completion. Quiet. Total. The specific, irreversible quality of something that has been waiting a very long time, finally arriving at the moment it was preserved for. And in the earth beneath his palm, the first king's presence, that 10,000-year-old will that had refused to simply end, did something Vegeta had not anticipated. It rested. For the first time in 10,000 years, the presence in the ground exhaled and rested. The key sustaining the record settling into a quieter frequency, no longer maintaining with the active effort of something that cannot afford to stop, but simply present, in the way things are present when their work is finished and they have arrived at the particular piece that only completion can produce. Go, the first king said, softly, with the specific quality of an ending that was also a beginning, the closing of one chapter and the opening of the next, in the voice of someone who has lived long enough to know that these two things are always the same moment. And do not accept any ceiling. Vegeta rose from his kneel. He stood in the circle of 7 stones, beneath the fixed stars of a world predating the divine record, with the ancient compact fully awake in his key, and the first king's last words resonating through the channel with the clean, structural certainty of a foundation finally, completely, permanently, at full capacity. The ancient aura expanded around him, slowly, continuously, with a depth and steadiness that his previous transformations, for all their power, for all their genuine transcendence, had not possessed. Not because they had been insufficient, but because they had been built on a foundation operating at a fraction of its capacity. And now the foundation was complete, and what rose from it was not a new form layered on top of the old architecture. It was the old architecture, finally operating as it had been designed. Whis, at the edge of the plane, drew a slow breath. Beerus stopped moving entirely. The key that rose from Vegeta did not announce itself. It did not perform. It simply was. That ancient, nameless color moving outward in those slow volcanic increments, deepening rather than expanding, going down into the ground of the universe rather than up toward its ceiling. The gravity of the plane responded to it, not by increasing, but by recognizing the 3 times standard weight of this world orienting itself toward Vegeta, the way masses orient toward each other when they reach comparable scale. The stars above did not dim. They held their fixed positions in the ancient sky, those anchored, permanent lights that had been burning above this plane since before the current divine order existed to name them. And they burned with a clarity that had nothing to do with distance or atmospheric conditions. A clarity that came from something simpler and more fundamental. They were witnessing, and somewhere in the dimensional layers above this ancient world, in the space between planes, where the Grand Omni-King had retreated to reconsider its approach, in the hierarchy that had spent 10,000 years compensating for the error of the seal, in the structure of 12 universes running on one engine, and calling the compensation adequate, something changed. A variable that had been resolved for 10,000 years became open again. A calculation that had been settled became unsettled. And the architect of all reality, in whatever passed for its perception across whatever distance separated its plane of existence from this ancient plane beneath fixed stars, felt it. The compact, active, complete, carried by a Saiyan who had refused every ceiling that had ever been placed before him, across a lifetime of battles that had each felt like the end, and none of them had been, carried forward into whatever came next. The journey back was not the same journey. The descent through temporal strata that had characterized their approach, that careful, deliberate navigation through layers of compressed history, each denser and older and quieter than the last, did not reverse itself on the return. They did not ascend. They did not retrace. Instead, the dimensional fabric between the ancient plane and the current universe seemed to recognize something in the quality of Vegeta's ki and respond accordingly. The layers parting rather than requiring navigation, the path opening rather than needing to be found. As though the universe's own architecture was making accommodation, the adjustment of a system that had been operating with a known deficiency, suddenly finding the deficiency corrected and recalibrating around the correction. Whis noticed it immediately. The transit is different, he said, staff moving through patterns that were responses to conditions, rather than the active navigation of resistance. The layers are not presenting the same friction as the descent. Because we're not the same travelers, Vegeta said. Whis looked at him, a glance that lasted perhaps 2 seconds, and contained within it the full assessment of someone who had been observing powerful beings for millions of years, and was now looking at something that his considerable experience had not quite prepared him to categorize. He said nothing. He returned his attention to the navigation, but the glance remained present as an acknowledged thing, a marker in the conversation that indicated something had been registered and would be returned to when the moment permitted. Beerus traveled in silence. The god of destruction had been largely silent since the plane, since the moment Vegeta had risen from his kneel and the ancient aura had expanded with that extraordinary quality of completion, that depth that went down rather than up. Beerus had stood at the edge of the plane and watched it happen, and whatever he had seen, whatever the experience registered as in the long institutional memory of a being who had been appointed to divine function before the current Saiyan civilization existed, had produced in him a quality of stillness that was different from his usual brand of bored composure. He was thinking, genuinely, effortfully, with the specific quality of someone re-examining premises that had been foundational for so long they had ceased to feel like premises and had simply become the texture of reality. He was doing the accounting that he had acknowledged on the plane could not be completed. But he was doing it anyway, in the partial, imperfect form available to him, because partial and imperfect was not the same as worthless and a god of destruction, with a conscience that had just discovered it had been operating on corrupted information, was going to work through that discovery in whatever way his nature provided. Vegeta did not interrupt this. He traveled through the parting layers of temporal strata, with the ancient compact moving through him in its continuous, even rhythm. And he thought about what came next, not in the anxious, exhaustion-driven way of someone trying to outrun consequences, but with the cold, methodical clarity of a tactician who has just received a decisive intelligence advantage and is now reorganizing his entire strategic picture around it. The Grand Omni-King had withdrawn to reconsider. It had not surrendered, had not retreated in defeat, had not abandoned the field in any meaningful sense. It had done what sophisticated entities do when a confrontation fails to resolve on expected terms. It had created space for reassessment. The backward movement in the void, the withdrawal through the dimensional boundary, the carefully constructed conversation that had simultaneously attempted to neutralize the threat and gather information about its nature, all of it had been tactical. The Grand Omni-King had arrived to stop the fracture from fully opening, and had discovered, through the direct experience of attempting to stop it, that direct action was not available to it. So it had shifted to information gathering and strategic delay, and had withdrawn when it had enough of both to work with. It was, Vegeta acknowledged without pleasure, exactly what he would have done, which meant the window between the withdrawal and the next action was not determined by the entity's emotional state or wounded pride. It was determined by how long the strategic reassessment required. And the Grand Omni-King was not operating under the cognitive limitations of a mortal mind. Its reassessment would be thorough, comprehensive, and conducted at a speed that the phrase, "as quickly as possible," did not meaningfully capture. The window was closing. He needed to understand what he now carried before it closed. Not in the abstract philosophical sense. He had the abstract philosophical understanding, received across the visions and the record of the ancient plane, and the first king's direct transmission through the channel of the compact. He needed the practical understanding, the phenomenological understanding, the warrior's understanding of how a new form of power moved through the body, what it responded to, what its relationship was to the power structures he already possessed, how it integrated with Ultra Ego and the Blue and all the accumulated thresholds he had crossed in a lifetime of refusing to accept ceilings. He needed to use it, not in battle, not yet, not against the Grand Omni-King or any other entity that would treat the use as an opening for their own response. He needed to use it in the contained, deliberate, intensely focused way that serious training required. He needed to feel it under conditions he controlled, before it was tested under conditions he didn't. "I need a place," he said. Whis, still navigating the parting layers. A training ground. Something isolated, outside the normal dimensional traffic, away from anything that would register the key signature and report it to the divine hierarchy before I'm ready to be found. A pause during which the angel processed both the request and its implications. There is a space, not a constructed training environment, nothing the divine archive has any record of, in the boundary region between Universe 7 and Universe 6, a dimensional fold. It exists in the overlap between the two universes' spatial jurisdictions, which means it falls outside the monitoring range of either universe's divine administrative structure. I have known about it for some time and have never mentioned it to anyone. Vegeta looked at him. Why? Because I have been, for a very long time, an angel in service of a divine order that I now understand was operating on a compromised foundation, Whis said, with a precision and a quietness that gave the words a weight that a louder delivery would have dissipated. And because even before tonight's revelations, there were moments, across millions of years of service, where something in my nature registered a wrongness in the system's architecture, that my access to the restricted knowledge did not give me the vocabulary to articulate. He did not look away from the navigation. I kept the fold's existence to myself because it felt, in some inarticulate way, like something worth having. A space outside the record. I did not know why until tonight. Vegeta held this for a moment. Then, take us there. The dimensional fold was not dramatic. No tearing of reality, no spectacular boundary crossing, no visual announcement of transgression against the established order of space. The fold revealed itself as a subtle wrongness in the fabric between universes, a region where the spatial geometry was slightly inconsistent with its surroundings. The way a painting is slightly wrong when the perspective has been rendered with an error too small to immediately identify, but immediately felt. Wyss navigated them into it, with the particular precision of someone who knows exactly where an unmarked door is, because they have been quietly noting its location for an extremely long time. Inside, the fold was approximately the volume of a small planet. Not in its physical dimensions, which were more compact than that, but in the quality of the space it contained. It had gravity, atmospheric pressure, a quality of light that was not sourced from any star, but existed in the fold as a byproduct of its position at the intersection of two universes' spatial fields. It was featureless in the architectural sense. No surfaces that could be called landscape. No variation in the floor that constituted terrain. Just space. Clean, isolated, unmonitored, outside the record. Vegeta stood at the center of it and turned his attention inward. The ancient compact was present throughout his key architecture. Not localized, not concentrated in any specific pathways, but distributed through the entire system with the thoroughness of something that had reorganized around itself, rather than being added on top of existing structure. This was the first thing he confirmed, and it was important. Previous transformations had been additive. Super Saiyan added a layer above base. Blue added a layer above that. Ultra Ego operated as a different configuration of existing resources. The compact was not additive. It was foundational. It had reorganized from the bedrock up, changing the fundamental operating principles of his key architecture, rather than adding capability to the existing structure. He needed to understand what those new operating principles were. He reached for Ultra Ego first, the form he knew best in its deep mechanics, the transformation he had pushed furthest, the threshold whose specific functional logic he understood most intimately, the principle of Ultra Ego. The more damage sustained, the more power generated. The deliberate inversion of the survival instinct, instead of protecting the body from damage, actively receiving it, converting impact into fuel, using the enemy's assault as the primary power source. The form that required, at its foundation, the complete elimination of defensive instinct. The form that only a Saiyan who had genuinely, constitutionally stopped caring about whether they survived could fully access. He reached for it and found it changed, not absent, not replaced or overridden or dismantled by the compact's reorganization. Present, fully accessible, recognizable in its fundamental nature, but operating on a different substrate now. The damage-to-power conversion that defined Ultra Ego was still the core mechanism, but the foundation beneath it, the bedrock on which that mechanism operated, was no longer the relatively shallow layer of willpower and battle instinct that it had previously rested on. It now rested on the compact, on the primal force below the divine architecture, on the specific underwritten guarantee of the absolute continuation. The implication detonated through his strategic understanding with the clean precision of a depth charge. Ultra Ego converted damage to power because the Saiyan will refused to acknowledge damage as a reason to stop. But the Saiyan will, for all its extraordinary qualities, was finite. It operated within the biological constraints of a mortal body, and there was, theoretically, a level of damage beyond which even the most absolute refusal to stop would be insufficient to maintain the conversion. A ceiling. The transformation had a ceiling, like every transformation. With the compact as its foundation, the damage-to-power conversion was underwritten by the primal force that the Grand Omni-King's authority could not supersede. The force that predated the concept of ceilings. The force that had recognized the Saiyan nature, the refusal to accept limitation, as its sovereign representative in the structured universe, precisely because that nature was the biological expression of the principle that no ceiling was final. The ceiling of Ultra Ego was gone. Not raised, not significantly elevated, gone. Removed not by an increase in the willpower sustaining it, but by a change in the ontological status of the will itself. From the extraordinary but finite will of a mortal warrior operating at the apex of his potential, to the sovereign expression of the principle that existence itself operated on. Vegeta stood in the dimensional fold and sat with this understanding for a long time. Then he let the compact move. Not Ultra Ego, not Blue. Not any of the named, classified, technique-oriented forms he had trained toward and achieved. He released the constructed architecture of all of them simultaneously, not abandoning them, not leaving them behind, but allowing them to settle back into the foundation the way furniture settles when you stop holding it in place, naturally finding its position rather than being maintained in it by effort. He released them and let the compact operate without the overlay of existing form. What happened was quiet. That was the most disorienting aspect of it, the absolute quietness of what occurred. Every transformation Vegeta had ever achieved had been announced. The hair, the aura, the ground shaking, the sky responding, the air itself becoming electrified with the surplus energy that a body undergoing genuine threshold-level change could not fully contain. Every transformation had been loud in the language of Ki. A declaration, a rupture, an event that the universe could not ignore. This was not loud. The aura simply deepened. The ancient color, that nameless frequency that occupied the space between all the colors the current universe's vocabulary could identify, expanded outward from his body with the slow, continuous, absolute confidence of something that had never needed to announce itself because its presence was self-evident. Not a flare, not an explosion, not the dramatic supernova collapse dynamic of transformations that operated by overloading the current system. The depth simply increased. The Ki simply moved through him at a level of integration that his previous forms had been reaching toward, without the foundation to fully achieve. The dimensional fold responded. The space around him, that featureless, clean, isolated volume at the intersection of two universes' spatial fields, began to behave differently. Not dramatically. The geometry of the fold shifted in subtle increments, the spatial relationships between different points in the space adjusting around the new gravitational fact of his Ki, with the quiet inevitability of space-time responding to a mass. The light in the fold, that sourceless luminescence produced by the intersection of two universes' fields, changed color. Not suddenly, but gradually. The ambient light of the space warming toward the ancient frequency of his aura, as though the fold's own illumination was orienting toward the dominant Ki signature within it. He felt the full scope of what the compact provided, not as an inventory, not as a list of new capabilities to be cataloged and tested in sequence, as an understanding, the phenomenological, full-body understanding that only direct experience can produce. The compact did not grant power in the way that transformations granted power. It did not add a multiplier, did not amplify output, did not increase the rate of Ki generation or the density of Ki expression. What it provided was more fundamental and ultimately more consequential than any of those things. It removed the walls. Every power system, every transformation, every technique that Vegeta had ever developed or trained toward had operated within the walls of his biological and energetic ceiling, the maximum possible output of a Saiyan body and will operating at absolute limit. The compact did not raise that ceiling. It dissolved the concept of the ceiling entirely, not by making him stronger than his maximum. That framing still assumed the existence of a maximum, but by changing his ontological relationship to limitation itself. He was no longer a being who had a maximum and was trying to approach it. He was the sovereign representative of the principle that maximums were temporary, the principle that the next level always existed, the principle that the wall was always, in the final accounting, a door. The aura deepened further. The fold's geometry continued its adjustment, the space recalibrating around the new fact of what stood at its center, with the patient, unhurried precision of a system integrating a variable it had not previously been required to accommodate. Beerus, at the fold's edge, had sat down, not in exhaustion, not in deference. He had simply arrived at a point where standing required a physical attention that he needed to redirect toward processing what he was observing. He sat cross-legged on the fold's featureless floor, with his divine energy held carefully close, and watched Vegeta with the expression of a god of destruction encountering, for the first time in millions of years of divine function, something that existed outside the categories his function had been designed to manage. "It's not a form," Beerus said quietly. Not to Vegeta, not quite to Whis, To the observation itself, it's not. There's no transformation. There's no point where one thing became another thing. It's just continuous. Yes, we said from beside him, equally quiet. Everything we've ever classified as power has been discrete. Points on a line. You achieve one level, then another, each one a distinct state with its own ceiling that you then push against until you break through to the next discrete state. Beerus watched the ancient aura deepen in its slow, continuous expansion. This has no discrete states. It's not moving between points on a line. It's changing the nature of the line, not the line, we said. The mathematician. Beerus looked at him. The transformations we know change what Vegeta-san can do. We said carefully, the compact changes what Vegeta-san is. In relation to limitation, he is no longer subject to the same ontological relationship with ceiling and threshold that every other being in the current universe operates within. Because the compact underwrites him at the level of the primal force, the force that the Grand Omni-King built its architecture above, the force that predates the concept of the ceiling itself. Beerus was quiet for a long moment. The Grand Omni-King is going to come back, he said finally. Yes, Whis agreed. And when it does, it will have found a new approach. The direct application of presence and authority failed. Erasure is unavailable. Negotiation was attempted and declined. Whis' voice was measured, assessing, carrying the specific quality of an extremely intelligent being, thinking through a problem in real time. It will attempt something that none of those approaches represent, something we have not yet anticipated. What does that leave? Beerus said. Whis was quiet for a moment that felt longer than its actual duration. I don't know, he said finally. And the admission, from Whis, who had navigated the complexity of divine service for longer than most civilizations had existed, who possessed the restricted knowledge of an angel and the strategic intelligence of someone who had spent millions of years operating at the apex of the divine hierarchy, landed with the weight of genuine uncertainty rather than false modesty. Vegeta spoke from the center of the fold. It will try to use Kakarot. Both of them looked at him. He had not moved. He stood in the center of the fold with the ancient aura moving around him in those deep, continuous increments, and his voice carried the flat, certain quality of a tactician who has completed a calculation and arrived at a conclusion he does not particularly like but cannot argue with. The offer it made in the void, Kakarot's restoration in exchange for surrendering the compact. That offer was genuine, not manipulative in the sense of being false. The Grand Omni-King can do what it offered. It can reclassify the erasure. It can return him. He paused. But that offer was also intelligence gathering. It was testing whether Kakarot's restoration was a pressure point sufficient to alter my choices. And he stopped. The ancient aura moved around him. The fold's light continued its slow orientation toward the ancient frequency. The geometry of the space held its adjusted configuration, with the patient permanence of space-time having recalibrated around a new gravitational fact. I didn't take it, Vegeta said, but I considered it. The Grand Omni-King is sophisticated enough to have registered the consideration even in the refusal. It knows Kakarot is the variable. It knows that the one thing capable of competing with the compact's pull on my choices is him. He breathed. So it won't offer the restoration next time as a transaction. It will use the restoration itself as the mechanism. It will return Kakarot, not as an offer, not as leverage to be declined. It will simply return him. And Kakarot, who has no knowledge of what has occurred, who died before any of this began, who will wake up in the current universe with no context for what he's waking into, Kakarot will be the variable the Grand Omni-King uses to create a situation that the compact cannot resolve cleanly. The fold was silent. Then Beerus said, with the specific quiet of someone arriving at a conclusion that costs something, Kakarot against you. Kakarot against me, Vegeta confirmed. Returned, resurrected, his power intact, his memory continuous up to the moment of his death, and deployed into a situation where the only way for me to continue is to oppose him, and the only way for him to do what he's always done, protect what he loves, fight for the people in front of him. is to oppose me."
He looked at his hands, at the ancient key moving through them. The Grand Omni-King doesn't need to defeat the compact. It just needs to create a situation where the holder of the compact defeats himself. The geometry of the fold held its adjustment. The ancient aura burned in its quiet, continuous depth. And somewhere in the space above this dimensional hiding place, in the divine architecture of 12 universes, running their careful compensatory systems against the absence of the balance, the Grand Omni-King was completing its reassessment, arriving at its new approach, preparing the variable. Vegeta felt the compact move through him with its continuous foundational rhythm, the primal force's sovereign representative in the structured universe, the living expression of the principle that no ceiling was final, the inheritor of 10,000 years of patient preservation, and the first king's extraordinary, underground, solitary act of faith. He thought of Goku, not with the grief that had fueled the rampage, not with that consuming, destabilizing, world-ending quality of loss that had broken open the ultra-ego and created the conditions for the fracture, with something quieter and more complicated, and ultimately more honest, the genuine, difficult, carefully examined truth of what Goku was to him. Not the simplified version, not the rivalry narrative or the parallel destiny framing, or any of the other clean stories that could be told about two Saiyans who had grown up on opposite ends of everything and arrived, somehow, at the same ceiling from different directions. The truth was, Goku was the only person alive who had ever made Vegeta's ceiling feel like a conversation rather than a wall. Not by being better, though he had been, for long stretches of their history, the more capable fighter. And Vegeta had spent enormous energy hating that fact rather than sitting with it honestly. Not by being morally superior, though his nature was different in ways that Vegeta had first experienced as naivety and had gradually, grudgingly come to recognize as something more interesting than that. But by being other in the specific way that genuine peers are other, present at the same level, comprehending the same stakes, occupying the same altitude of existence where most of what applied below no longer applied, and the specific loneliness of that altitude was, at least in the presence of the other person, not quite so complete. The Grand Omni-King was going to return him, and then it was going to use him. Vegeta closed his hands slowly into fists. The compact moved through the gesture, through the specific mechanics of those hands closing, through the tendons and bones and the deliberate architecture of a warrior's grip, and deepened. Not in response to the anger, not feeding on the emotional temperature of the moment the way ultra-ego fed on the exhilaration of battle. The compact did not feed. It simply continued. It was not responsive to emotional weather because it was not weather. It was foundation. It was bedrock. It was the thing below the thing below the thing that could not be moved by what moved on the surface. He had one advantage the Grand Omni-King had not accounted for. He knew it was coming. And knowing it was coming meant that when Goku arrived, when those eyes opened in the current universe, carrying the memory of the person he had been up to the moment of his death, confused and powerful and good in that specific, irreducible, infuriating way that was simply who he was, Vegeta would not be ambushed by it. He would be ready. Not to fight him, that was not the play, would never be the play. The Grand Omni-King understood the rivalry, but had perhaps not fully accounted for what 17 years of the truest form of that rivalry had actually built between them. Not opposition. Not enmity. Something harder to weaponize. Comprehension. The ancient aura expanded one final time, not in crisis, not in the dramatic announcement of a power reaching its threshold, but in the quiet, continuous, unremarkable way of something settling into its permanent configuration. The form he would carry forward from this dimensional fold, from this isolated space at the intersection of two universes' geometries, from this moment of private, unhurried reckoning with what he now was and what was coming. The fold's light held its ancient frequency. The geometry of the space held its adjustment, and Vegeta stood at the center of it. Broken arm and fractured ribs, and all the honest physical accounting of a body that had been through more in the last several hours than most bodies experienced across lifetimes. And the ancient compact breathed through him with the completeness of something finally, irrevocably
permanently awake.
Not a new power, not a new form, a new fact, one that the current universe, the divine hierarchy, and the architect of all reality were going to have to build their next moves around. Because it was not going anywhere, and neither was he. They emerged from the dimensional fold into a universe that felt different. Not structurally. The 12 universes held their configurations with the mechanical reliability of systems designed by the most sophisticated intelligence in existence. And nothing Vegeta had done in the preceding hours had altered the physical architecture of reality in any measurable way. The stars were where they had been. The planets maintained their orbits. The divine hierarchy's administrative apparatus continued its careful, compensatory operation across all 12 jurisdictions with the uninterrupted efficiency of machinery that does not require the conscious attention of its operator to keep running. But something had changed in the quality of the space. He felt it as they cleared the fold's boundary. A subtle shift in the way the universe's ambient key moved around him. The way the fabric of space-time registered his presence. Not recognition in any conscious sense. Not the universe experiencing awareness of what had occurred on the ancient plane. Something more fundamental than that. The adjustment of a system that had been operating with a known gap in its architecture for 10,000 years, and had now, through the activation of the compact in the body of its sovereign carrier, found that gap closed. The single engine had become two. It had not become two dramatically. Not with the apocalyptic announcement that such a fundamental structural restoration might have seemed to warrant. It had simply completed. The way a circuit completes when the final connection is made. Not an explosion of new energy, but the quiet, comprehensive activation of a system that had been carrying its current in one direction for 10 millennia and could now carry it in both. Vegeta felt it in the compact. In the way the primal force moved through him with a slightly different quality than it had in the fold. More connected somehow, more integrated into the surrounding architecture rather than operating in parallel to it. As though the universe itself had recognized the restoration of its second principle and had begun, cautiously and incrementally, the process of reorganizing around the new fact of its own completeness. "It's different out here," Beerus said. "Not a question. The system is recalibrating," we said. He held his staff at a slight angle, reading something in the dimensional substrate with the concentrated attention he had employed during the descent to the ancient plane. The ambient key distribution across. I would need more time to map it precisely, but the preliminary reading suggests the change is universe-wide, perhaps multiverse-wide. A pause. The Grand Omni-King will have felt it. It felt it the moment the compact fully activated, Vegeta said. On the plane, when I made the choice. He looked at the space around them, that familiar current universe quality of light and dimension and spatial geometry, so different from the ancient plane's fixed stars and dense gravity and key-saturated dark earth. It has been preparing since then. How long do we have? Beerus said. Vegeta considered this with the honest precision of a tactician who has learned that optimistic estimates are a form of self-deception that only helps the opponent. Less than we would prefer, he said. More than nothing. He looked at Whis. Is there any way to determine what approach it's taking before it arrives? Whis was quiet for a moment. The particular silence of someone consulting internal resources that are extensive but not infinite. Angels have access to a form of interdimensional resonance reading. It is designed primarily for navigational purposes, detecting the chi signatures of divine entities moving through dimensional boundaries, identifying the approach vectors of beings traveling between planes. I have never attempted to use it to read the approach of the Grand Omni-King, specifically because, until tonight, there has been no occasion to do so. He paused. But the principle should function regardless of the entity being read. The Grand Omni-King's movement through dimensional space, even its movement between its own plane and the structured universe, would generate a resonance pattern that the instrument should be able to detect. Then detect it, Vegeta said. Whis closed his eyes. The staff in his hands glowed. Not the blue-white of ordinary divine navigation, but something deeper, more complex. A light that seemed to be reaching outward through the dimensional fabric in multiple directions simultaneously, rather than illuminating a single path. His expression settled into a quality of concentration that Vegeta had only seen on it a handful of times across the years of their association.
the expression of someone using a tool at the absolute boundary of its design specification and relying on the skill of the operator to carry it past the point where the tool's own capability ended. The silence stretched. Around them, the universe continued its quiet recalibration. The ambient chi distribution shifted in those slow, barely perceptible increments, not enough to disturb the physical operation of any system, not enough to register in any divine administrative monitoring framework as an anomaly requiring investigation, but present to Vegeta's perception with the clarity of someone who now carried the second principle of the universe's fundamental architecture in the full channel, fully awakened state of the ancient compact. He used the silence to assess his body. The broken arm, the left, fractured in 2 places below the elbow and 1 above, with the associated muscle and tendon damage of a limb that had been used past the point of structural integrity. The ribs, 2 confirmed fractures pressing against each other with each full breath in a way that was painful, with the honest specificity of tissue that has exceeded its mechanical limit. The eye, sealed still beneath bruised and swollen flesh, the vision in it reduced to light and general form rather than useful detail. The accumulated key pathway damage from 4 hours of ultra-ego at sustained critical overload, which the compact had partially reorganized around but not repaired. The pathways were reconfiguring under the new foundational architecture, but reconfiguration was not the same as healing, and the process was ongoing rather than complete. He was still significantly damaged. The compact did not change this. The primal force that underwrote his sovereign standing in the structured universe did not reach into his cellular biology and repair torn tissue or knit fractured bone. It was not that kind of power. It was, as the first king had said, not a power at all in the ordinary sense. It was an ontological condition, a change in his relationship to limitation. The body still had its damage. The body still operated under the honest, unambiguous constraints of physics and biology that no amount of ki could fully exempt a physical form from. What had changed was his relationship to those constraints. He was not stronger than his injuries in the crude sense of being able to override them through ki output. He was sovereign with respect to them. They were present. They were real. They imposed their costs on everything he did. But they did not constitute a ceiling. They were not the final word. They were the current condition of a body that was at its foundational level underwritten by the principle that the current condition was never the final condition. He would fight in this body, damaged and fractured and held together by will and the ancient compact and the specific load-bearing stubbornness of a man who had never in his life accepted that the present moment was the last one available to him. And it would be enough, not because he was invincible, not because the compact had elevated him beyond the reach of harm, but because enough had always been a moving threshold for Vegeta. It had always been the threshold that existed exactly one step beyond wherever he currently stood. He had spent his entire life arriving at enough and discovering that enough had moved and choosing to follow it. And that choosing had been the single most defining characteristic of everything he had ever been or done or become. The compact had not given him a new enough. It had removed the point at which enough would finally, permanently stop moving. "I have something," we said. His eyes opened. The staff's complex, multi-directional light faded back to its ordinary blue-white. His expression, when Vegeta looked at it, was carrying something that the angel's composure was visibly working to contain. Not fear, something more complicated than fear. The expression of someone who has received information that changes the scope of a situation significantly and is taking the necessary half-second to integrate the change before communicating it. "It is not approaching from above," we said carefully. The resonance pattern does not indicate descent from the Grand Omni-King's plane into the structured universe. The movement is lateral, cross-dimensional. It is approaching through the boundary between the structured universe and... He stopped. "And what?" Beerus said. "And the death realm," we said. The silence that followed was of a specific quality that the preceding silences of the night had not possessed. Not the silence of awe, not the silence of processing, not the silence of standing in the presence of something ancient and overwhelming. The silence of a puzzle completing, of disparate pieces that had been lying in separate corners of understanding, suddenly, with the arrival of one final piece, resolving into the image they had always been parts of. The Death Realm, the dimension where the dead resided, where the souls of those whose bodies had been destroyed waited in whatever form of continued existence the current divine order's architecture provided for them. The dimension that was, in the current system's framework, a component of the divine hierarchy's management of existence. Not external to the order, but embedded within it, one of the many planes that the Grand Omni-King's construction had designed and maintained. The dimension where Goku was. "It's not coming from me," Vegeta said. His voice was flat and completely certain. Not directly. Not yet. He looked at the dimensional space around them, the current universe, recalibrating, the ambient key shifting in its slow increments. It's going through the Death Realm because that's where it needs to go first. To prepare the variable, he breathed. It is retrieving Kakarot right now. Beerus swore. A short, genuine expletive that carried the specific quality of a being whose worst expectation has been confirmed. "You were right." "I was right," Vegeta said, without satisfaction. "Which means the window we had, to prepare, to understand, to establish any kind of position before the situation becomes what the Grand Omni-King wants it to become, has just become significantly shorter." He looked at Whis. "Can you tell from the resonance pattern how long before Kakarot is returned to the structured universe?" Whis consulted the staff again. A briefer, more targeted reading, looking for a specific piece of information within a signal he had already established contact with. The process of retrieving a soul from the Death Realm and returning it to the structured universe, even for the Grand Omni-King, is not instantaneous. The Death Realm operates on different temporal mechanics than the structured universe. The transit between planes requires, I estimate, and this is a rough estimate with significant uncertainty, between 1 and 3 hours by Universe 7's reckoning. 1 to 3 hours. Vegeta looked at his broken arm, at the ancient aura moving across his skin in its continuous, quiet depth, at the space around him, the current universe, his universe, the 12 universes of the divine order that had been running on one engine for 10,000 years and was now, in the slow and quiet way of systems too large for dramatic announcements, beginning to remember the second one. 1 to 3 hours to prepare for the most complicated confrontation of his life. Not the most powerful, not in the straightforward combat sense. The Grand Omni-King was the most powerful entity he had ever faced, or would face. And that confrontation was still coming, would always be coming, was the defining conflict of everything the compact represented, but the most complicated. Because the most complicated confrontations were never the ones against enemies. They were the ones against people you could not categorize as enemies. People whose presence in your life had been so fundamental, so constitutive of who you had become, that opposing them required opposing a part of yourself that had been built in the space their existence had created. He needed to think, not plan. Planning required information he did not yet have, specifically the information of how the Grand Omni-King intended to deploy Goku, what framing it would give him, what context it would provide or withhold, what it would tell him about what had occurred in his absence, and what it would carefully omit. Planning against an unknown deployment was the construction of elaborate architecture on unmapped ground, productive as an exercise, dangerous as a substitute for adaptability. He needed to think about Goku, about what he knew of him, not the rivalry, not the power scaling, not the combat history that they had accumulated across a lifetime of parallel evolution toward a ceiling that kept moving. What he knew of the person, the specific, irreducible, occasionally maddening, genuinely extraordinary quality of what Goku fundamentally was. Goku fought for what was in front of him. This was the core of it, the thing that distinguished him from every other powerful being Vegeta had ever encountered, including himself. Not the power, not the technique, not the transformations or the instincts or the battle hunger that they shared as Saiyans. The specificity of his motivation. Goku did not fight for principles in the abstract. He did not fight for the restoration of divine balance, or the correction of cosmic errors, or the inheritance of ancient compacts, or the vindication of a bloodline that had been deliberately suppressed for 10,000 years. He fought for the person standing in front of him, for the earth behind him, for the specific, concrete, present-tense human reality of the people he had chosen as his own. Not as a philosophy,
but as an instinct so deep it operated below the level of choice. The Grand Omni-King would tell him something. It would provide a version of events, carefully constructed, internally consistent, weaponized, that positioned Vegeta as a threat to those specific, concrete people, to the Earth, to the universe Goku had spent his life protecting. It would give him a target that engaged his fundamental motivation, rather than attempting to argue him into a position, because the Grand Omni-King was sophisticated enough to understand that Goku could not be argued into fighting someone he loved. He had to be shown that someone he loved was in danger. So it would show him, and Goku, who was good in that specific, irreducible way, who had never developed the political sophistication that prolonged survival in complex divine hierarchies required because he had never needed it, who trusted the evidence of his eyes and the instinct of his heart with a simplicity that was simultaneously his greatest limitation and the thing that made him nearly impossible to genuinely deceive. Goku would respond to what he was shown. He would come with everything he had, with the full, extraordinary, ceiling-breaking power of the being who had arrived at Ultra Instinct through a different path than Vegeta had arrived at Ultra Ego, through the complete surrender of the ego rather than its complete embrace, through the dissolution of the self rather than its maximum expression. Two Saiyans who had found the same ceiling from opposite directions and had pushed through it into forms that were, in some deep structural sense, complementary. Each one the expression of a principle the other embodied the inversion of. Vegeta and Goku. Ultra Ego and Ultra Instinct. The maximum expression of self and the complete dissolution of self. And the Grand Omni-King was going to try to make those two complementary expressions destroy each other. He thought about this for a long time. Standing in the current universe, in the quiet recalibration of a system remembering its second principle, with the ancient compact breathing through him in its continuous foundational rhythm, and the window of 1 to 3 hours closing steadily around the moment of Goku's arrival. Then he thought about something else, about the first king. On the ancient plain beneath fixed stars, kneeling at the threshold of the seal, making the decision that would define the next 10,000 years of his bloodline's existence. The choice of reduction over elimination, the choice to trust the nature rather than the outcome, the choice to press the record into the earth and the compact into the bloodline and wait, in the ground, in the darkness, for 10,000 years without knowing, because the alternative was an ending he refused to accept. The exponential response to pressure, the first king had said. The growth that accelerates precisely when the cost of growing is highest. Vegeta looked at his broken arm, at the fractured ribs pressing against each other with each breath, at the sealed eye and the damaged ki pathways, and the body that had been through more in the last several hours than any reasonable accounting suggested it should have survived. He thought about what it would mean to face Goku in this condition. Not to fight him. He was not going to fight Goku. Had made that determination with the clarity of a tactical conclusion rather than the sentimentality of an emotional one. Because fighting Goku was exactly what the Grand Omni-King needed him to do, and he had never in his life given an opponent exactly what they needed. But to face him, to stand before the one person whose power and nature could genuinely test the compact's new architecture at the foundational level, not by damaging it, but by demanding something from it that power alone could not provide. He thought about what he would say, not the words. The words would find themselves in the moment, as they always had, because neither he nor Goku had ever been the type to rehearse. The architecture of it, the approach, the specific, difficult, unprecedented thing that the situation required, which was not battle and not argument, and not the performance of strength designed to make Goku stand down, which was trust. Not trust in the abstract, not a philosophical position, the specific, costly, two-directional thing that existed between people who had spent years on opposite sides of the same ceiling and had watched each other push through it enough times to know, with the bodily certainty that transcended conscious decision, that the other person was not someone they could afford to stop believing in. If Goku arrived carrying the Grand Omni-King's version of events, if he arrived with a target and a motivation, and the full extraordinary force of his nature pointed in the direction of someone who had apparently gone dangerously wrong, then the only thing capable of interrupting that momentum before it became irreversible was not a more powerful counterforce.
It was truth, delivered without defense, without the performance of certainty. In the full, specific, unprecedented quality of one Saiyan telling another Saiyan what had actually happened, what Vegeta had done and why, and what it had cost, and what it had produced, and what the universe was now becoming because of it, and trusting that the person on the other end of that truth was capable of receiving it across whatever narrative the Grand Omni-King had constructed around it. Trusting the nature. The nature, the first king had said, is not something that can be diluted out of existence. Goku's nature, that specific, irreducible quality of him, that goodness that operated below the level of choice, that capacity for comprehension that was not intellectual but physical, that existed in the body and the key and the specific frequency of his being rather than in any conscious processing, was not something the Grand Omni-King could rewrite. It could provide context. It could frame events. It could construct a narrative and deliver it to a person whose trust in the evidence of his eyes was genuine and deep. But it could not change what Goku fundamentally was. And what Goku fundamentally was someone who had looked at Vegeta, across every terrible thing they had each done, and every ceiling they had each broken, and every version of themselves they had each discarded in the process of becoming the next one, and had never stopped extending his hand. The window continued to close. "We stay here," Vegeta said finally. Whis and Beerus both looked at him. "We don't run. We don't find another hiding place. We don't attempt to establish any position or create any advantage before he arrives." He looked at the space around them. The current universe, recalibrating, the second principle quietly restoring the balance that had been missing for 10 millennia. "We stay here, in the open, and when Kakarot arrives, carrying whatever version of this the Grand Omni-King has given him, we are exactly where we are. Not hiding, not preparing, not performing any posture designed to communicate something before the conversation begins. You're giving him the opportunity to arrive on his own terms," we said. "I'm refusing to make the first move in the Grand Omni-King strategy," Vegeta said. "It wants us maneuvering. It wants the situation to have momentum before Kakarot arrives. It wants him to arrive into something already in motion, where the only available responses are the ones the Grand Omni-King has pre-positioned." He paused. "We stop. We wait. We give him stillness instead of motion. And when he arrives, I talk to him." "Just talk," Beerus said, with a complex expression that was not quite skepticism and not quite something he had a word for. "Just talk," Vegeta confirmed. "The way we have almost never done, in an entire shared history that has consisted primarily of fighting each other and then, eventually, fighting alongside each other, with very little of the space in between used for the thing that might have made both of those activities more meaningful." He looked at his hands, at the ancient aura moving through them, at the nameless color that the current universe had no vocabulary for, because the last time it had existed freely, the gods had rewritten the dictionary to exclude it. He deserves to know what happened. All of it. The Grand Omni-King's version will be sophisticated and internally consistent and designed to engage his fundamental motivation. The only counter to that is the truth, given completely, without defense, and trusted to be sufficient. Whis was quiet for a long moment. Then, and if it isn't sufficient, if the Grand Omni-King's framing has been constructed with enough precision that the truth, delivered without context Kakarot has no way to verify, is not enough to interrupt the momentum. Vegeta looked at him. "Then I'll deal with that when it happens," he said simply. "I'm not going to preemptively betray the trust by planning for its failure." Another silence. And in the silence, in the quiet recalibrating space of a universe remembering its second principle, something shifted. Not in the dimensional fabric, not in the key distribution, not in any physical or energetic measurement. In the quality of the moment itself, the specific atmospheric quality of a situation that has arrived at its pivot point, the instant before the direction of everything becomes determined by what is chosen in the next several seconds or minutes or hours. Whis nodded. One single, unelaborated inclination of his head that carried within it something Vegeta had never received from the angel before. Not approval. They were past the dynamic where approval was the relevant category. Recognition.
The recognition of one being by another that has seen enough of the world to know when something is being done correctly in the deepest available sense. Beerus sat down again. Not in exhaustion, in preparation. The preparation of someone who has decided that what is coming deserves to be witnessed from a position of stillness rather than motion, received rather than managed. The god of destruction sat on the floor of open space and drew his divine energy close and waited with the particular quality of waiting that belongs to beings who have lived long enough to understand that some moments cannot be hurried and should not be. And Vegeta stood in the current universe, in the open, with the ancient compact breathing through the full architecture of his being in its continuous, foundational, unremarkable rhythm. Not performing, not announcing, simply present. The way bedrock is present, the way gravity is present, the way the second principle of a universe's fundamental architecture is present when it has been restored to its rightful operation after 10,000 years of deliberate suppression. He thought of the first king, in the ground of the ancient plain, having delivered the inheritance he had spent 10,000 years preserving, finally resting. That 10,000-year vigil completed. The work finished. The bet, made without any guarantee of its soundness, revealed in its final accounting to have been the right bet. Not because the outcome was certain, not because the universe had guaranteed it, but because the nature had been trusted, and the nature had done what nature does when it is trusted rather than managed. It had produced this moment. This Saiyan, standing in open space, carrying the compact and the inheritance and the name the first king had given him in the space below thought. Waiting, without armor, without pretense, without any prepared defense against whatever arrived next. The name. He had not spoken it aloud, had not, in all the hours since the first king had delivered it through the channel of the ancient plane's key memory, placed it into the air of the current universe, had held it internally, in the foundation, in the bedrock, in the place below thought where the oldest parts of the self reside, as something that was fully his without requiring external declaration. But it was time. Not because the moment demanded ceremony, not because the declaration would grant him anything he did not already possess. The compact was fully active, the channel was fully open, the inheritance was fully received. Not for any strategic reason, not to announce anything to the Grand Omni-King or signal anything to Goku or communicate anything to Whis or Beerus. For himself. Because names had power, not in the mystical sense, but in the most honest, fundamental, irreducible sense. The sense in which naming a thing is the act of fully acknowledging its reality, of standing in complete relationship with what you are, rather than what you were, or what others have decided you were, or what the systems built above you found convenient for you to be. He spoke it quietly, in the dead language, in the language of the fracture that was no longer a fracture, of the channel that now ran fully open through the complete architecture of who he was. In the language that lived below thought and arrived as music, as meaning received in the place where the oldest parts of the self reside. The name the first Saiyan king had carried. The name pressed into the dark earth of the ancient plane, along with the record and the will and the 10,000-year active faith. The name that was his now, not as inheritance in the sense of obligation, but in the truest sense, the sense that had always been the only sense worth having, as continuation, as the living forward movement of something that had refused, across 10,000 years of suppression and 17 generations of deliberate diminishment, to become the past. The ancient aura moved around him as he spoke it, not dramatically, not in the explosive announcement of something being claimed, in the quiet, self-evident way of something settling into its correct position. The way a keystone settles when it finds its arch, completing the structure not through force, but through fit. The space around him held the name for a moment, and then the universe. That incomplete, compensating, single-engine system that had been holding its breath for 10,000 years, exhaled, quietly, completely, with the specific quality of a thing that has been waiting for something to complete, and has just, in this moment, found itself complete. The stars nearby did not dim. They did not lean closer as they had above the ancient plane. They were the stars of the current universe, with the current universe's relationship to permanence and motion,
And they did not hold still, and they did not hold memory the way the fixed stars of the ancient world did. They moved, they burned, they continued. But in the ambient key of the space around him, in the recalibrating, second principle restoring, quietly reorganizing fabric of a universe remembering what it was supposed to be, something resonated. Brief, almost imperceptible, a single pulse, traveling outward through the chi distribution of the current universe at the speed of something that was not light and was not sound, but was the specific frequency of a truth being recognized by the system that had been built, however deliberately and however unjustly, above it. A recognition. The universe acknowledging the name, acknowledging the carrier, acknowledging, in the only language available to a system too large and too distributed for conscious communication, that the variable had changed, that the calculation that had been settled for 10,000 years was open again, that the second engine, the sovereign representative of the principle that no ceiling was final, that limitation was not law, that the next level always existed because existence itself demanded it, was running, was here, was carrying the name forward into whatever came next. Vegeta stood in the open space and breathed and waited. His broken arm hung at its fractured angle, his ribs pressed against each other with each breath. The sealed eye remained sealed. The body held its honest, unambiguous accounting of what it had endured. And the ancient compact breathed through all of it, through the damage and the exhaustion and the ordinary human-adjacent fragility of a physical form that had been pushed far past its designed limit, through the grief that had not resolved, would not resolve cleanly, might never resolve cleanly, because grief of that scale was not a problem to be solved, but a terrain to be lived in and moved through with as much honesty as you could sustain. Through the uncertainty of what was coming, the Grand Omni-King's next approach, Goku's arrival, the conversation that would either succeed or fail on the foundation of a trust built across decades of shared ceilings broken and not on any guarantee. Through all of it, continuous, foundational, present, the way bedrock is present beneath everything built above it, not loud, not announced, not requiring acknowledgement from the structures resting on it to perform its function, simply there, underwriting, guaranteeing at the level of the most fundamental available architecture that what stood above it would not fall because it had run out of ground. The window continued to close. Somewhere in the dimensional space between the current universe and the death realm, the Grand Omni-King moved through its new approach with the sophisticated, patient, terrible intelligence of the being that had authored the rules by which all power was measured, bending those rules in the specific direction it had spent 10,000 years maintaining, toward the outcome it had decided was the only acceptable one. And somewhere in the death realm, in whatever form continued existence took for a soul as extraordinary and uncategorizable as his, Goku waited, not knowing he was waiting, not knowing that a window was closing, or that the architect of reality was crossing dimensional boundaries toward him, or that the universe he had died protecting was quietly, incompletely, but genuinely remembering something it had forgotten, not knowing any of it. Just Goku, irreducible and undiminished, and constitutionally, fundamentally, maddeningly good, waiting to open his eyes. Vegeta breathed, and held the name, and waited. The stars burned quietly around him, moving, impermanent, following the arcs of their galactic orbits through the vast, unhurried choreography of a cosmos that was, in its deepest and most honest architecture, not a finished thing, but a becoming one, as it had always been, as it was made to be, as it would continue to be for as long as the sovereign representative of its second principle stood in it and refused, characteristically, constitutionally, magnificently, to accept any ceiling as the last one. The stars burned quietly, and in their light, the name carried forward into the next threshold, into whatever ceiling came next, into the only ending that had ever been available to a Saiyan who carried the compact. Not an ending, a continuation,